Chester Henson, a police captain, was deeply outraged that his boss was asking him to close the case. The man was not joking at all and could not change the situation, since the order to do so came to him from above. The captain could not imagine how he could turn a blind eye to the counterfeiting of bonds worth $150 million, so he openly expressed his dissatisfaction. The boss fumed, threw the sign from the table directly at Chester, but missed, and the sign flew into the wall. Despite this, Chester was stubborn, so he had no intention of giving up. The staff wondered how he dared to contradict the boss himself, but Chester was sure that he was behaving inappropriately. Chester's phone received a call from an unknown number, and he answered, introducing himself as the head of the Department for the Investigation of Intellectual Crimes. When the man was informed that his mother had died, the world around him seemed to collapse, and his eyes darkened. Observing the sharply changing emotions on the face of the junior boss, one of the employees began to worry and assume that he had been punished. Chester said nothing, put the phone in his pocket, and ran in panic towards the exit. Other employees in the corridor, tired of the constant attention of reporters, also did not understand where the man was in such a hurry when he needed to recall the investigation team. As soon as Chester ran out onto the porch of the building, he was immediately surrounded by reporters with questions about the progress of the case. The man pushed one of them, blocking the way, and moved to his car. A colleague followed him into the street, but it was too late, and Chester stepped on the gas pedal and went to the morgue. He flew at breakneck speed, squeezing into his seat, tears streaming down his cheeks. Junior employee Henderson shouted into the phone that those responsible had come to the building and were going to turn everything upside down. When Chester began to beat his hands on the steering wheel and scream, he understood everything, promised that he would deal with everything, and asked his comrade to be more careful. The driver of the truck in the next lane caught up with the man and cut him off, completely demolishing the left fender. Chester hit his head on the steering wheel and was badly injured, but he was still conscious. The truck driver inspected the damage, smiled slyly, and said that the cause of death of the man's mother was a case that he did not want to close. He opened the door of the car and took the video recorder, which is an important piece of evidence. The stranger had a snake tattoo on his wrist. A faint smell of wood emanated from him, and his voice betrayed a not quite young age. Chester passed out for a while, but began to come to his senses when he heard the voices of the guys around him. The situation looked familiar, as if he had seen it before. A crowd of young men with bats, a quiet alley in spring. That day in 1997, when Chester was 17 years old, looked strange, like a memory that pops up before he dies. If he hadn't received the first day from these freaks that day, he would have continued to practice judo. Perhaps he would have become not a policeman, but a champion or coach of this sport. Be that as it may, it was worth meeting with my mother for the last time, before these memories finished flashing. Then the guy tried to stop the hooligans extorting money, but now the plan of action was different. He turned one of them, the main instigator, over with a grip and dropped it on the concrete. For causing grievous bodily harm and attempted murder, the guys faced punishment under the 9th and 10th Articles, even if the law on minority protected them. Chester smiled mischievously, for their misdeeds were about to come to an end. However, the guy did not hit them back, but only walked forward and jumped over the fence. He did not have time to play with the kids, because he should have seen his mother as soon as possible. In the neighboring territory, he met a girl dumbfounded by what was happening, watering plants, apologized to her, and ran away. Despite his bloody forehead, Chester ran with all his might through the streets of the city, not noticing passers-by around. When Chester realized this, he hugged his mother with all his strength and promised himself that this time he would definitely protect her. From behind a nearby counter came a brightly painted lady with hair cut above the shoulder, Sylvia Diamond, a woman with 5 convictions for fraud. For about 3 years, she was engaged in real estate scams, gaining the trust of people who were ready to invest money. As a result, the victims lost a total of a little more than $200,000. After this, the mother, who had been limiting herself all her life by collecting money, was very depressed. Then Chester was very angry, so he called her good for nothing. But now he realized that he had behaved like a psycho. Sylvia noted that the son of a merchant looks very respectable, just like his father, a policeman. A father who left such a son and died in a car accident. For these filthy words, Chester was ready to cut into the woman, but with difficulty restrained himself. He decided to let Sylvia talk while she could, because he could just denounce her and send her to jail. Chester was hurriedly and nervously stringing the fish pie on skewers, but his mother stopped him because she couldn't sell so much anyway. The boy did not know that his mother had walked so far every day since she was younger, when she was a little over 30, and all for the sake of such an ungrateful son as him. Now, every day, even after a head injury, he walked with her, helping to push the grocery cart home. In those days, there were few chain eateries, so my mother began to make a kimbap, which was bought by office workers on the way to work. Chester didn't know how to make the diner prosper, but he had eaten so much kimbap while he was in ambush on missions that he knew which product would go off with a bang. The next day, he brought dried squid in a spicy sauce to make it a kimbap filling. The guy made sure that everything was done correctly. Less rice, more squid. Mom tasted what came out in the end, and it was incredibly delicious, although there was nothing special about the recipe. Chester wanted to stay behind to help her cook more, but in a couple of minutes, the filling was already completely distributed. The guy said goodbye, asked him to write on the pager in case of anything, and walked towards the subway, while his mother followed him with her eyes. Even with age, he did not want to go to school, but he had to change in order to catch his mother's killer. Classes began with a delay and a meeting with a disgruntled coach, Sean Gunter, a real mentor who supported and helped Chester after the injury. As soon as the guy saw him, he was immediately happy and rushed to hug him, putting the man into a stupor. When he saw the bandaged head of the guy, he immediately began to examine him from all sides. Since Chester had 25 stitches, although he did not like it, it was forbidden to play sports for the time being. The guy went into the hall to say hello to his older comrades and then go to class. Seeing that someone had smashed the head of the junior judoka, they boiled over and were already preparing to find the offender. One of the features of the judo section was that from the very first day in the section, the guys were considered members of the same family, no matter how long they had known each other. In a past life, after Chester injured the ligaments on his finger and elbow, they dealt with the school bullies before he left. In order to buy time and kick out these bullies, Chester needed the help of the guys from the section, because they could legally deal with almost any problem. The guy was sure that this time he would definitely graduate from the High School of Police, take the post of chief, and find those criminals who killed him and his mother. Although Chester was embarrassed that he had caused the boys so much trouble, they promised that they would deal with the cretins who had attacked one of the 10 men. Chester thanked them as he said goodbye, but in his heart he gloated and rejoiced, for soon these freaks would have to pay for what they had done. Coach Sean, who was promised something completely different when applying for a job, came to the director with an appeal. He tried to stop the hooligans who extorted money, and as a result, 10 of them beat him alone. It was impossible to allow this to school children, so the coach wanted to take the guys and move with them to another school. The director could not allow the coach to stop bringing so many medals to the school, so he promised that the teacher working with children would figure everything out. No matter where, near the entrance to the school, in the dog kennel, Sean insisted that the bullies be caught before the first lesson began. Chester went into the classroom, sat down at his desk, and laid out his things, but so far, no one had come in. Then he decided to make a plan and a list of victims. The one who killed him may have been an accomplice, or the same person who killed his mother. The bell rang, and the same girl he had met when he was running away from the hooligans came into the office. Chester decided to say hello and apologize for the incident, but heard nothing in response. The guy decided that she was ignoring him because he talks like a starper, but the girl was just wearing headphones. For Chester, a moment of nostalgia came because in her hands was a cassette player, a legend of those times. Finally, a classmate paid attention to him and, having found out, said that she immediately called the police, so everything immediately calmed down. She did not say that the guy broke the fence, and he, still being a policeman, was upset, because then the testimony of witnesses could support the version. Whether she was polite or really worried, she still asked how her classmate's head was to make sure that everything was in order. By this time, the hooligans arrived, who were clearly not happy with the good health of the judoka because they had already managed to scold them on the first day. With a laugh, Chester rose from his seat, for he was a head taller than the boys, so he did not worry about being defeated again. Luke, the main instigator of the group, was a little confused, but he couldn't leave everything as it was. Otherwise, the seniors would come to deal with them again. From the inside pocket of his shirt, he took out a cutter with a sharp blade and flew at the guy. This time, Chester decided not to tolerate the student's antics, so he dodged and grabbed him by the throat so hard that the cutter fell to the floor with a crash. A crowd of onlookers gathered at the windows of the office, watching with interest what was happening between the judoka and the hooligans. Chester almost went too far with the force of compression, but at the right moment, a classmate called out to him and brought him to his senses. This time, Luke was lucky, but now his way of making money through extortion was a big question. The guys, still realizing the danger of the situation, gathered and headed in the direction of the exit from the office. At the end of the lesson, the children thanked the teacher, and he looked at Chester contemptuously. Due to the fact that the coach probably told the teacher about what happened, he did not say anything about the student's broken head. Although in those days there was no separation of character and assessments, now Chester could be considered just another hooligan. In addition, the next day the class had to write an independent work, and this could be a problem. Chester had no idea how he would do it at such an age, and even with a broken head. Their school was famous not only for its judo section, but also for its high level of education. The guy remembered how hard it was for him because of the independent ones that he wrote every 2 weeks after he quit the sport. However, it didn't last long, because in his last year of high school, he came to his senses and the tasks began to come easily. If Chester hadn't joined the patrol for fear of running out of money, he would certainly have entered the police high school. In any case, it was only an independent program according to the program of the first year of high school. So the guy thought until he opened the textbook. Chester had to remember objects that he did not remember at all, so his eyes fell on a classmate sitting at the next desk. He came closer, asked for help with the preparation and to show the notes. When the classmate agreed, Chester thanked him, calling him a boy, realized that he was now his age, and corrected himself to his friend. During the break, many people ate snacks prepared by their parents, but the guy who agreed to help disappeared somewhere. Sarah's classmate, on whose territory Chester had climbed at the time, told him that Shed had been at the buffet. He had been taken somewhere by school bullies. The children ran to the dining room, but Shed was not among the students. On the street, the back entrance to the buffet was also empty, so they decided that the guy could be on the roof. As expected at this time, Shed was standing on the roof, all beaten, holding on to the railing, looking down. The guys, quickly climbing the steps, ran to the roof, but there was no classmate there either. When they decided that he might have returned to the classroom, they went back and found the guy at the roof extension. He sincerely apologized to Chester for not keeping his promise. He was suddenly molested by hooligans, so he had to go with them. In fact, Chester felt guilty, because probably the guys just wanted to take out all their anger on someone who turned out to be weaker than them. He belligerently promised that he would deal with the hooligans, but he was abruptly interrupted by his stomach, which at the most inopportune moment decided to rumble. After school, the children all went to eat at a nearby eatery on Chester's initiative. Upon returning, his body was simply shattered, that he could not eat even one portion of anything, but now his stomach was filled to the hilt. Shed's mother had said that coffee from the machine interfered with growth, and Chester laughed as he took another sip. The guy really believed that there was a connection between coffee and height. When Chester asked if it was not easy for a classmate all this time because of school bullies, his face changed dramatically. The judoka promised that there was no need to worry about this because they would not touch him again. He was going to make sure that the guys wouldn't dare to touch anyone at all. He was going to change this world, and Shed just needed to help him a little. It seemed that this was what the reporter Paco looked like in his youth, and he also wore glasses. The morning was already starting well, so the guy was pleased. The day before, an unknown person sent Paco a parcel with a cassette and a letter, probably acting as a witness. When he learned that the school children earned $36,000 on extortion, the man was dumbfounded, so he immediately began to write an article to investigate. Reporter Paco knew how to write beautifully from a young age, so there was a bright headline on the front page of the morning newspaper. The teacher noticed that Chester had a newspaper in his hands, and he said that he had recently begun to read them often. Judging by the expression on the man's face, everyone in the teacher's room already knew about what had happened. That same afternoon during the break, Chester handed out the morning newspaper to ordinary students and judokas. He admitted that he had sent some information to the editorial office because he could not tolerate the bullying of hooligans. Of course, the judokas could have quietly dealt with them, but it was better to strike from both sides. The hooligans would not admit their guilt if they were beaten well. On the contrary, they would still say that they were beaten by athletes. If the guys had fought with these scum, they could have put an end to their future. It would have been better to deal with them in an adult way. Chester hoped that when the hooligans saw the article about themselves, they would not dare to say anything more out of fear, because if someone got hurt, he would be able to report it to the police. Shed and Sarah had also spotted the reporters outside the school, which seemed to be the second stage that Chester had talked about the day before, which was the newspaper. A classmate was sure that it would not be useful, but the police would not sit still when there was such a headline on the front page of the newspaper. Only the last stage remained, for which it was necessary to first prepare for independent work. On the record, Shed said that he did not have enough money, so he worked part-time at a gas station and handed out leaflets. In total, more than $2,000 were taken away from him. In addition to him, about 2 people in each class suffered, and most likely about $80 were taken from them every month. It turned out, if you take at least 40 school children, then about $36,000 a year came out. There were very few questions at the upcoming test, probably because the students wanted to go home early before the police arrived. The teacher was in a hurry to collect the sheets from the back desks, but all this was useless. After looking at Chester's test, he accused him of picking answers at random. In fact, the guy solved problems on his own, and Shed and Sarah supported him in this. They prepared together, and the girl even gave him a trial test. An announcement came from the loudspeaker that Chester Henson was being asked to go to the principal's office, and he grinned as he walked out of the office. Disgruntled parents had already gathered in the corridor, not understanding what to do. The social pedagogue approached the guy and asked him to say that he did not know anything if he was asked about something. Chester was a little disappointed that someone who called himself a teacher would ask for such a thing, but he pretended to understand. In the director's reception office sat those whom the guy did not expect to see at all, gentlemen investigators. Chester recognized them, so his father also worked as an investigator, maybe not in the same department, but they sometimes crossed paths with his father. The man worked in the eastern section and by the will of fate died in a car accident. The investigators heard the name of the student's father, and their eyes climbed to their foreheads. It was the same former wrestler, Devin Henson. One of the men began to ask how his mother was doing, and Chester realized that everything would go faster than he thought. It was clear that the guy was the son of an investigator, as he quickly figured out what plan of action these people had. No one could even imagine that he himself had held the position before, so everything was familiar to him. To begin with, Chester wanted to write a statement and open a case for causing serious injuries during attempted murder and gang beating. Investigators realized that he was the one who provided the information to reporters, and the guy apologized for not following the procedure. The bullies bullied other students, which went too far, but the teachers took it as harmless jokes. He had no other choice. He immediately suspected that everything was clearly planned. First, Chester would like to catch those who beat him, and then gather the victims and give them the opportunity to testify without fear for their safety. He nudged the investigator lightly in the shoulder with his elbow, and like a seasoned policeman, hinted that the man would probably get the bonus too. The guy wanted to accuse the hooligans of attempted murder, which means that they had to pay the amount that he would name. Those who beat him with a stick, $15,000, and everyone else $7,000. He also recorded the victims' testimonies and the names of the hooligans, and the investigator, rejoicing at such a find, called him to work for the police in the future. Next in line was the invitation of the parents, the examination of the testimony, and a conversation with the culprits themselves. As soon as the parents were given the right, they immediately burst into the office screaming, accusing Chester of slander. The investigator explained in clear language that if they did not agree with the guy, who had a huge number of stitches on his head, to cancel the statement, their children would have to eat prison balanda. Even if no formal charges were filed, he could file a lawsuit in the future, when the children grew up, and then they would not be affected by the law for minors, at which point the parents drooped. Chester winked at the investigator, asking what the average amount of compensation for moral damage was. He understood everything and named the amount of $3,500 more than previously agreed. Without compensation, there could be no agreements, and if people did not reach a compromise, then the punishment would be like for adult criminals. In addition, compensation had to be paid to the rest of the victims, so Chester reduced the price to the one he originally announced. Now the parents were completely terrified. The investigator also confirmed that if compensation is paid, children can still be sent to a juvenile colony, because the punishment for such a serious crime depends on the court's decision. Not only were the parents in complete despair, the hooligans who heard everything outside the door also began to give up. Chester was happy and made sure that Shed could tell the investigators about what had happened without fear. In the late afternoon, Mrs. Henson also came to the school at the request of the police, thinking that he had done something. Since she signed an agreement on compensation, the lawyer of the guilty party had to transfer the specified amount to her account. When the detective praised Chester, Mother was a little embarrassed, for he had come to his senses lately, so she herself was still unaccustomed. In addition, when they said goodbye to the man, her son told her that he took 15th place according to the results of the independent exercise. Mrs. Henson was so pleased with Chester's success that he promised that he would continue to try. When the bosses called out to senior investigator Kevin to praise him, junior investigator Paco asked that a word be said for him as well. Kevin looked out the window and saw Chester. After all, he was an unusual guy. At the beginning of the lesson, the teacher announced that the grades for independent work were already hanging on the stand. According to the results of independent work in April, Chester was in 15th and then in 6th place in the class. In May, I was in 3rd place, and in the practice exam, I took 25th place in the entire school, so I began to get used to learning. The doctor said that the guy was completely healthy, so now he could return to sports. The headmaster told Chester not only to play sports, but also to study, and the coaches heard the news that he had taken a good place in the school. In the locker room, the guy froze for a while, taking his uniform in his hands. He had not seen it for so long. Before the start of training, the guys, as usual, put things in order in the hall and warmed up. Chester was only 17 years old, so he had a strong body with which to start practicing judo again. It was nothing compared to what it was before his return, a fresh body that doesn't get tired. Sparring began, so the guys divided into pairs and stood in racks. The older comrade Chester had been raising his nose too high lately, so it was worth bringing him down to earth a little. When he grabbed Chester, there was a strange feeling again, as if everything was somehow slow. Probably this athlete was going to not only fight, so Henson tripped him and dropped him to the floor, falling from above. Of course, he apologized for the fact that his leg automatically jumped off, but agreed to continue the fight. As they continued, Chester had a strong feeling that the judoka was openly bullying him, but he could not leave it just like that. Even the coaches noticed that the guy was always trying to use the technique, wanting to show who was older. As far as Chester could remember, this guy was supposed to win a bronze medal in a few months at the competition and get into the national team, but now he put him to bed without much effort. In a past life, Henson had a knife wound, so 2/3 of his stomach had to be removed. After that, he lost a lot of weight. Although it was not easy for him to fight criminals, he used judo techniques all this time. And now amazing physical data and unprecedented abilities have been added to them, which are hard to believe. At this rate, Chester could have won a gold medal at the Olympics and entered the higher school of police. He could do all this if only he could find the freaks who killed him and deal with them. When Chester pressed his opponent to the floor again, the coach stopped their sparring. The man suggested that he played sports with an injury. He ran, stretched, trained so that the muscles did not stiffen. Chester bowed again and apologized for not understanding how his opponent wanted to teach him to hold a stance. After training, at the request of Sean's coach, he went into the coaching room and admitted that he was still working in secret. Then the man handed him a tire and asked him to pull with all his strength. Before the injury, this guy only pressed with his body, and now his reaction, the strength in his wrists, the overall strength, everything was at the highest level. When the coach asked how the athlete trained, He replied that he was engaged in burpees, hand walking, and CrossFit. Only after saying this and seeing the bewilderment on Sean's face, he realized that these exercises gained popularity only in 2010, coming from America. Still, Chester found a way to get out of it. For the training that his coach taught him, he needed mats, and he didn't have anything like that at home. So he said that he was looking for different methods and accidentally stumbled upon this one. In America, judo was taught terribly, so the coach wondered what he could learn there. In fact, these were exercises not for judo, but for American football players. Professional American football athletes ran an average of 40 millimeters in 5 seconds, knocked down an opponent weighing 100 kilograms with one finger, and jumped over football players of other teams under 190 centimeters tall. It was they who performed burpees, hand walking, and CrossFit in training. Chester learned these techniques when he was an ordinary police officer to tone his muscles. The guy was about to leave when the coach thought about it and asked him to stay longer. After talking to someone on the phone, Chester said that detailed information would be sent to the school mail. The coaches were amazed that he was able to get contacts with the help of a computer, but even more impressed that he learned English well, almost perfectly. Previously, Chester studied English, Japanese, Chinese, Russian, and even Vietnamese in order to catch criminals abroad. Most likely, the NFL was flattered that Korean students wanted to learn their methods, which is why they so easily agreed to provide the materials. It was also worth trying to contact Japanese schools and ask them for training materials. A couple of hours later, a letter came from the NFL, and Japan, being happy with a closed country in this regard, refused to share the materials. Chester translated some of the NFL exercises to begin with, but it had to take some time to translate all the pages. In addition, it would take at least a month or two to translate additional materials related to rehabilitation, first aid, and others. Hearing about this, Coach Pablo shouted in surprise and asked the guy to translate this information first. Pablo was the technical assistant to the head coach, and at the same time the team's doctor and administrator. He met with the parents of school children even more often than the head coach himself. After taking the materials for translation, Chester left, and Coach Pablo saw him off with a dull look. When the coaches were left alone to drink coffee, Sean expressed doubts about the guy's classes. He was smart, so instead of sports, he could calmly study. Pablo suggested watching the athlete first, so after a little thought, the colleague agreed with him and asked him to check Chester's condition more often before the training camp. Coach Sean finished his coffee and went home, and the technical assistant was left alone with the thought that Sam, the older athlete, had lost to the younger one. Pablo was paid for the participation of the elder in the competition, and if Chester had taken the lead, the problems would only have increased. Perhaps it was worth telling the guy to start studying, but there was so little time left before the training camp that he would not have had time to prepare well anyway. When Chester returned home, the table was set as lavishly as if his mother had won the lottery. In fact, she took money from the stash. The woman has already managed to save more than $7,000. She hoped that if everything worked out with the investments that Aunt Emily had talked about, they would be able to move into a better apartment. It was the same woman at the trade pavilion, hiding under a different name and advising her mother to buy currency with gold. Her mother, being open and trusting to the world, told her about her father and the money that her son received. They had recently become best friends, and Emily evoked the feeling of a woman who understands investments. Sylvia Diamond began to act faster than in her previous life, so she had to find a way out of the situation as soon as possible. The next morning, the usual queue gathered at Mrs. Henson's pavilion, quickly sorting out the products. Sylvia, watching from around the corner, was jealous that she raked in the money so easily. She was going to organize a project for $220,000. But she found out that the son of a saleswoman was friends with the police. Now there was not much profit, but Sylvia planned to take the proceeds of this day and immediately fly to Southeast Asia. At the same time, senior investigator Kevin received a call from Chester Henson from a landline. Gradually, the queue at the mother's counter ended, like a Kimpat prepared for sale. Recently, the goods had been flying away quickly, so that in the afternoon, he and Sylvia were able to cross paths. The woman was ready to immediately go to the bank to take all today's proceeds, but someone approached them. It was Chester who missed judo training in the company of Detective Kevin. Sylvia began to get nervous, and for good reason, because the man immediately revealed both her real name and being wanted. The woman decided to go on the attack, claiming that she was being threatened for nothing, but eventually, seeing the handcuffs, she ran away. In the alley through which it was possible to get to the main street and hide, she was intercepted by investigator Paco. A few minutes earlier, on a nearby street, Chester had met with Kevin and his colleagues. He led the police to the diner just in case it was necessary to block the escape routes. It was worth putting people on the main road and alley so that the criminal had nowhere to run. Kevin was surprised how the guy had time to think through such details, but put Detective Kim and Paco on the supposed streets. Chester explained that he found it strange that a woman had promised her mother too high a percentage, and when he met her, he remembered seeing her face on a wanted poster. Sylvia Diamond had been on the wanted list for a long time before this incident. She was quite nimble and constantly escaped, but this time she was not going to succeed. When the woman was arrested on suspicion of fraud and attempted fraud, Mrs. Henson thought it was some kind of mistake. Then Sylvia said that she should have run away earlier with the money, and her mother began to sob and scream, not understanding how it was possible to betray her trust so much. Chester tried to calm his mother, but when he heard the insults in her direction, he was terribly angry. There was a thirst for retribution in his eyes, so investigators Kim and Paco grabbed the guy to prevent him from doing anything to the woman. He turned out to be stronger than the men expected, so he simply pushed them aside and flew at Sylvia like a tank. Horror was on the faces of everyone present, and Mother grabbed Chester to stop him. While she was trying to persuade him not to touch the woman, Sylvia ran to the police car and, sitting down, shouted for the driver to move. It's a good thing that the investigators managed to catch her before she could get the money. Otherwise, Mrs. Henson got into a major scrape. Chester thanked the men and apologized for pushing them, and Kevin laughed that they both played sports at one time but couldn't keep one boy. When the chief investigator told Mrs. Henson that she was lucky to have such a reliable son, he began to think. After all, he returned to protect his mother, and for this he needed strength, including in the form of money. At the crime department, Detective Kevin was summoned, and Chester remained waiting at his desk. Seeing business cards in the organizer, the guy decided to take a few pieces, but came across one unusual. The business card stood out from the rest, and it had the contacts of fund manager Paul Garland. The investigator returned and offered Chester something tasty for helping to solve the case. However, the guy was most interested in which manager this business card belonged to. Kevin wanted to trust him with his money. He found out through his channels, and Paul only said that there would be a crisis in the country and they would go bankrupt. It dawned on Chester that this was the same Paul Garland he had met during the national bankruptcy. The investigator believed that the manager was talking nonsense, so he crumpled up his business card, but the guy asked to take it for himself. Paul predicted that everything would be like during the Great Depression in the United States. Bankruptcy of companies, large-scale restructuring in order to reduce costs. During the presentation, the head of the foundation took all the theoretical materials and threw them at Paul. He was sure that the country was in its heyday in its entire history, and in such a situation, it was stupid to talk about some kind of bankruptcy and crisis. Paul was frustrated that there was no one who took the problem seriously. Britain and Japan were in trouble now, so Korea could not come unscathed. As he sat in the stairwell of an office building, he received a call from Chester, who was interested in the national bankruptcy he was talking about. The guys agreed to meet in a cafe before high school and talk about the details when they met. Coach Sean hit Chester on the head with his stick when he saw him sitting at the computer in his office. He deliberately exempted the guy from training so that he would prepare for the exam, and he would wipe his pants at the computer. Chester explained that he wanted to send exam preparation materials to the others, but he covered the monitor with his hands so that the coach would not see what was really there. Of course, he lied, but maybe it was really worth sending them notes next time. Chester asked to use the computer sometimes, and the coach allowed him to do so if he didn't tell anyone. Sean also said that investigator Kevin recently called him and promised that he would make a policeman out of the guy. The coach left Chester a jar of juice, asked him not to overexert himself and not to come back with a broken head, and left. In a past life, Henson had worked with the Financial Supervisory Service many times before becoming head of the Intellectual Crime Division. When you deal with swindlers, gangs, usurers, employees of the bank and district administrations, that is, with economic criminals, you begin to learn various details of their lives. Now the guy was making a table of data that he remembered. In other words, it was an economic book of predictions. If you start digging on the basis of this data, you could prevent the murder of your mother and your own death, as well as acquire capital. When the exams were over, Shed and Sarah rejoiced heartily, planning how they would have fun. Chester had not slept for several days because of the preparation for exams and the preparation of materials, and in the future he had to be even more busy. The boys' faces even changed, perhaps because the exams were over, or because there were no more bullies at school. Especially Shed, he began to feel comfortable and smile more. Since they had all passed, Chester offered to play on the computer together at his expense. All this time, they were doing nothing but studying, and school children also had to be able to have fun. Even if the guys somehow hit or hurt themselves, it would still remain in their memory later. Studying for the sake of his future was not bad, but these guys were not like Chester living his life anew. He wanted his classmates to know how to have fun while they could. The guy advised them to spend time so as not to regret anything, because later, when they grow up, they will sometimes drink and remember the old days. Shed did not understand what this moralizing was about, and Sarah said that the classmate looked like her aunt, who came from a corporate party. A man walked around the school and looked for a teacher about whom the students were not aware, thereby frightening them. Hearing the frightened exclamations of the schoolgirls, Chester came closer to figure out what was happening. It turned out that the man was looking for a teacher named Chester Henson, but this teacher turned out to be the student in front of him. The man was surprised when he realized this, and his voice seemed familiar to the guy. The manager, Paul, thought he had arranged a meeting with the school teacher, so he was in a hurry, but it seemed to be some kind of prank. Chester fully understood his embarrassment, so he finally introduced himself and reminded him that they had agreed on Saturday. He asked the guys to go to the computer club for the time being, and he went to meet with Paul to prove that he was not wrong about national bankruptcy. They came to the coffee shop, made an order, and sat down at the table opposite each other. Paul introduced himself again. He was the manager of the Securities and Asset Management Department of the Western District. Their meeting happened faster than Chester had planned, but on the contrary, he had more time to convince the man. Paul was interested in where the guy got his report, and he explained that he had an acquaintance who was involved in this field. The guy looked very young, but he gave the impression of a rather serious person, and if it were not for the school uniform, the man would not even guess how old he was. From his backpack, Chester took out some materials that he had prepared earlier, a list of companies with powerful legal management. In surprise, Paul got up from his seat. LLC Group was also included in this list, and the materials themselves contained operating losses of companies after expansion. It turned out that the collapse of just a few large companies could lead to the bankruptcy and crisis of the entire country. Chester added a few implausible theses, but it was after such content that the man could draw up the scenario of the crisis that he had already mentioned. Paul was interested in how, in his opinion, events would unfold in the end, and he said that a world economic crisis would come. Korea will receive emergency financial assistance from the IMF, and then it will find itself under economic sanctions. In 1997, the world crisis engulfed the whole of Asia, and at that very time, a direct blow fell, including on Korea. The government, which pursued a policy of increasing gross national income by more than $10,000, also sold foreign currency to join the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Eventually, Korea experienced a currency crisis that no one expected. When everyone else did not want to admit the approach of this crisis, the only person who declared the threat of national bankruptcy was Paul Garland. If you look at the current situation in Korea, it was at its peak. Banks easily issued loans no matter how much you ask. However, what all this could lead to would eventually line up in a sandcastle called duty. The moment Korea receives emergency financial assistance would mean collapse. The entire economic sphere would follow the IMF's directive without the possibility of stopping. Korean enterprises would be too weak, and foreign exchange reserves would no longer be enough. In addition, thanks to the economic upswing in the country, it was too common to believe that prosperity and sanity would last forever. For such unfounded optimism, Korea could end up in a real hell. As Chester said this, the glass from the waitress's tray fell to the floor and shattered to pieces. Chester knew how things were going to unfold, so his job was to give hope and faith to people who live in the present and have hope for the future. He bent down and handed the waitress a handkerchief so that she would not hurt herself on the shards of glass. Chester said that he was going to invest more than $73,000, said goodbye, and left Paul alone with his thoughts. When the guy entered the computer club, the guys were already playing video games with might and main, as if they were not waiting for him at all. Sarah was constantly beating Shed, and Chester volunteered to fight her. At one time, he just flew in this game. Literally, a minute passed, and he won the girl, attracting the attention of the visitors around. Chester was relaxing with friends, but he was still thinking about what Paul Garland was doing. The man could postpone the moment of choice as much as he wanted, but the result would still be the same. A few days later, it became clear that Chester was suffering from thought, and not him. But the guy could not call first, otherwise he would cease to be in a leading position. Chester had only given him half of the materials, so it was high time to grab the bait. Perhaps Paul took advantage of the data and merged, but this was unlikely. In the past, he was somehow involved in financial fraud, but he himself said that he did not do it on purpose. The man was a gullible lawyer who defended fraudsters. The lesson began, and the teacher announced that it was time to announce the grades that the students had been waiting for so long. Whoever scored less than 100 points had to receive 1 stroke for each point. The first student in line scored 78 points and received 22 strokes. To everyone's surprise, the teacher barely touched the guy's thighs with his stick, although he was not one of those who hit so weakly. Finally, after all his classmates, it was Chester's turn. Only 5 blows awaited him. The teacher smiled, anticipating how he would take revenge on the student for the fact that because of him, the man had trouble with his parents and superiors. A girl in a business suit got out of her sedan and picked up the phone from her father. He asked if his daughter was still engaged in the management of other people's property, but all this time she was a private banker. The man believed that other people were just using her, but he did not call for this. His second daughter lived happily with her husband, a teacher, and he wanted the same for his first daughter. The girl pretended that she had problems with communication and hung up. Their sister had different criteria for happiness. So Casey, a banker, hoped that her business would burn out and her father would not be able to say a word to her. Finally, after climbing the steps of the building, she opened the door and found herself in a room with several guards and a man greeting her. Casey sat down in the chair across from her and asked about her business, running into the assertion that she was too impatient. The man claimed that everything was going smoothly because he had paid a lot of money in Hong Kong and bought a stock program, and his precious employee was doing his best. Paul Garland greeted the girl and came closer. He looked careless, but she only cared that her investment was profitable. Director Kim slapped the man in the face and suggested that he shave so that no one would think he was holding him in captivity. When Casey said it wasn't that important, Kim fell silent and immediately changed his face. They had to trust each other, which meant keeping their promises, but he wasn't bold either. At the same time, in high school, the guys were trying to understand why the class teacher from the entire class hit only Chester with all his strength. He studied well and played sports, so Sarah assumed that he just did something wrong and did not notice himself. In any case, the exams were over, and now it was possible to concentrate on training. When Chester asked what the boys would be doing, Sarah, nervously fingering, suggested that they go to her house. Her mother had cooked dinner and suggested that her daughter invite her friends over. Chester's training was not supposed to start until the next day, so there was still time. Then Shed exclaimed that his mother also said to invite friends, and he had been waiting for this day for a long time. It seemed that both of them had never invited friends home in their lives. The guys were like nephews who asked to play with them. Since it wasn't just today, Chester decided that they would go to Sarah first and Shed next. The guys approached the gate of the girl's house and saw how gorgeous his territory looked. You could say that Chester had already been here once, when he was running away from hooligans. When they entered the house, Sarah's mother was glad that her daughter had brought guys, and not one, but two. She introduced them, and her mother focused her attention on Chester, who looked exactly as her daughter had described him. The guy thanked the woman for the invitation and gave her a gift that he had brought with him. Sarah's mother warned that she would prepare a treat and sent the guys to sit in a room on the second floor for the time being. As they walked down the hallway, they noticed their aunt's open room, which was a mess. It was a great opportunity to visit her, so Sarah decided to take a look first and then go to her room. Grandfather did not allow my mother's sister to live separately until she got married, so she lived with them. Chester took a closer look at the documents on the table and realized that they were the same materials he had given Paul. It was probably not just a leak of information, so he asked Sarah what her aunt was doing. At this time, her hostess came into the room, clearly not expecting to see the school children. A couple of minutes ago, she came home from work early and found her sister cooking dinner. Since Sarah invited friends to visit, her mother decided to feed them, and her sister was also invited to the table. Going up the stairs, the woman was glad that there would be ribs for dinner, but her satisfied face changed as soon as she heard a noise in her room. Sarah began to make excuses that the door was just open, but this did not save the situation. Chester then apologized and took the blame, saying that he had begged Sarah to come in because he had seen books on finance and economics. When the woman heard that he was interested in stocks and investments, she immediately changed her dissatisfied look to interest and delight. Her eyes sparkling, she was ready to tell everything he wanted and even show his portfolio. Given that Sarah's mother's last name was Kwan, it could be Madame Kwan, known to Chester before. She was a private banker and managed the finances of many entrepreneurs and politicians, thanks to which she gained fame in wide circles and valuable information. In a past life, she often helped Chester and had the nickname Madame Kwan. Her time had not yet come, but in the near future she was to become a well-known private banker. Now it was clear how she knew Paul Garland. Chester wanted to ask about Korea's huge debt, but this conversation could drag on, so the guys went to dinner together. Sarah sighed heavily and whispered to Shed that her aunt loved to talk about economics. When late evening came, the guys thanked Sarah's mother for her hospitality and went home. After a couple of streets, they went on opposite sides, promising each other that they would meet next time at Shed's. Chester walked towards the phone booth, and after rummaging in his pocket, pulled out Casey Kwan's business card. At the table, when the woman was telling the guy about the stocks, Sarah asked her mother to stop her, and she suggested that Chester just take a business card. Thanks to her, he managed to get a business card, but he did not have time to ask the most important thing. Casey's phone received a call, and although she had no idea who was calling her at such a time, she still picked up the phone. Hearing Chester's voice in the other direction, she thought he had forgotten something, but when she heard that he had a question for her, she was glad. The joy did not last long, because the guy asked where Paul Garland was, and said that he himself made a list of companies. The format had been changed slightly, but the content remained the same, so Chester wondered how Casey got the material. At first, she could not believe that it was a schoolboy, and then she realized that it was not Paul's idea. It was not his level, which meant that everything could fall through, and her father would never recognize her abilities. Chester added that if she was deceived and forced to invest money, she should return it to herself. In order to catch the tiger, you had to go to the den, and in order to get the money back, you had to look where Casey left it. The sign in Director Kim's office was slowly beginning to peel off, showing which company had been in the room before. The man told Paul that he had done a good job and could now go home. When the manager asked about investments and profit sharing, Kim said that he sheltered him when he was almost fired. He began to scream, indignant at how he dared to ask for money almost to save his life. An extraneous sound was heard outside the door, and Kim sent one of his guards to check on the situation. After a few blows, the door was knocked down, and the hero of the occasion appeared behind it. Chester got into the room and ordered no one to move. Kim was interested in what kind of idiot broke into someone else's office like this and knocked down the doors. The guy could be a cop, but he looked more like a schoolboy. So far, Chester was not a policeman. He just had something to do with Paul Garland. Kim promised that he would not ask his employee to do this, and asked the guards to deal with the guy. When one of them approached Chester, Chester pushed him aside and asked Paul only one question: if he was there of his own free will. The manager asked the guy to run away from here, and that was enough to understand everything, and a security guard flew up to him. After Chester's intervention, the future of Paul Garland and Casey Kwan changed. Initially, Paul, along with colleagues who were of the same opinion with him, left the company, founded an investment company, recruited people, and began to attract investors. But now, when he saw the guy's materials, he hastily took a loan from the bandits, so they took these materials from him and forced him to work. As a result, he approached Casey, who had a considerable amount of money in her hands, which she had already handed over to the borrower. On the day they spoke on the phone, Chester explained that the police should not be called, and that if Paul was really kidnapped, she could be accused of complicity. Chester could not allow Sarah's aunt to become a criminal, and it was not yet clear whether Paul had been kidnapped. Although the guy was almost sure of it, if the manager volunteered to help them, then even the police could not do anything. Chester gave the woman the contacts of an investigator he knew, and explained that if he did not return from the building in 5 minutes, she should call and tell everything. So Casey did, hoping that nothing would happen and the guy would cope. Meanwhile, Chester was defending himself from the guard he had been hit by a moment ago. The man passed out, and the guy himself was surprised, not thinking that he would fall from one blow. Observing the deplorable situation, Kim sent all the guards at once, but it was even better. In his 26 years in the service, Chester met completely different criminals, and such brutes were commonplace. There were also drug addicts who immediately grabbed sharp objects, as well as terrorists and former Special Forces soldiers with illegal firearms. It was quicker to name those with whom he had not yet fought, so such big men, who differed only in height, did not pose any danger to him. Also, the guys were so slow, as if Chester was seeing everything with a slow effect. One of them swung at the unexpected guest, but he dodged, hit him in the jaw, and knocked him to the floor. The other also missed, and Chester elbowed him in the solar plexus. In judo, the weight category was important, and in such indiscriminate fights, not what weight you have, but experience. The last guy, big and bald, was probably the best of all, but he didn't seem to train hair follicles at all. Angered by Chester's remark about his hairstyle, he got into a fight, but also flew to the side. Kim had no more boyfriends left, but he was not going to give up just like that, so he grabbed a knife. While he thought that the guy was from some gang and tried to stick a knife in him, he deftly dodged, hitting his hands. Chester was not used to using weapons because they only occupied his hands, but all sorts of freaks who were nothing loved stabbings. He twisted the criminal's arms and kicked away the knife that fell to the floor. Kim tried to get out, but was hit in the stomach, and Chester yelled at Paul to grab the materials. Approaching the table by the window, the manager found papers, but heard a noise from the street as if there were police officers somewhere nearby. If Chester's goal had been to save Paul, there would have been no need for him to come here in person. His other goal was to solve the crime that Kim almost dragged Madame Kwan into, as well as to hide his own materials so that they would not fall into the wrong hands. The thug asked if the stranger had called the police, and it was ridiculous. With such a dumb head, making an investment was unimaginably stupid. Chester grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, threw him over his shoulder, and slammed him against the table. The leg of the table broke, and the ashtray with cigarette butts decorating it flew to the side. By this time, the investigators had already entered the room and ran to the aid of the guy. Stuffing accomplices into cars, police officers wondered where only such people came from, as if for a selection. Kim tried to justify himself, but it sounded so pathetic and cowardly that Detective Kevin wanted to stab him in the filthy mouth. When Chester thanked the man for his prompt work, he happily pinched the guy's cheek. He should have been scolded for breaking into the bandits alone, but the guy looked unharmed, as if he was confident in his abilities. In order not to sound too presumptuous, Chester said that he simply believed in the help of the police. He also told how he knew about the victim Casey Kwan. She was his friend's aunt and was worried that her acquaintance was kidnapped and kept in captivity. Investigator Kevin explained to him that Kim Douglas is a very unpleasant guy who kidnaps financiers, threatens them, and turns financial frauds. Everything happened as Chester assumed. The owner who saw Paul's materials on Kim's loans kidnapped him, held him hostage, forced him to give these materials and work for him. and Madame Kwan, to whom Kim handed over these materials, unsuspectingly gave him a large sum. In the end, it was possible to save Paul and return the materials, but Chester's role in this case was completed. When the guy came out of the ward, Paul began to apologize for causing so much trouble. The man who first received from Chester, Choi Smith, was a classmate of the manager. The man did not even suspect that he worked in a loan office. He just wanted to get money as soon as possible. They were friends in childhood, so Paul agreed to such a business. When Mrs. Kwan suggested that the man was very lonely, he thanked her and wished them both to earn a lot of money. Paul coveted a lot of money, which he could not cope with, so he decided to leave everything until no one got hurt because of him. Chester wasn't going to leave everything as it was, so he reminded the man that the materials he showed were only half. Paul was still hesitant, and the banker Kwan decided to talk to him on her own. She could get an amount that was more than what she was going to invest in Kim's office, as she did not want to give up halfway. He and Chester seemed to think alike, but he understood why Paul was hesitant. Even if his data had been 100% correct, the stock could have fallen, and he was even more worried after such an incident. Paul could not refuse and give up everything just because of some criminals, because he had a brilliant instinct. Very soon, Chester was to give him the rest of the materials and offer his ideas to continue the game. Casey offered the guys a ride in the car, but the phone in her bag immediately began to vibrate. Her uncle, her father's brother, already knew that the girl had just left the station. She lied that she had been in a small accident, but he knew that too, so he called. The girl was embarrassed that her plans had changed, but she had to go to her parents. Kwan's father was a very strict person. In the past, he ran a loan office, so he was very sensitive to any problems with money. Chairman Kwan Hong was quite a prominent figure in this business and a wealthy man. Surprisingly, probably even in retirement, the man used his influence, since he already knew about what had happened in the morning. Casey apologized again, said goodbye to the guys, and went to her father. When she came to the door to the room, she wanted to run away as soon as possible, but she had to control herself. The girl opened the door, and right in front of her at the tea table, she saw her father and uncle. Mr. Kwan finished his tea, put 3 photographs of the young people on the table, and asked him to choose one. To begin with, Casey asked him to look at a list of companies with powerful legal management, but the man did not even want to listen. He believed that the girl should not do anything at the police station, and she should immediately wind up her business. Then she promised that if her father said the same thing after looking at the materials, she would immediately drop everything and go on a date, and in 6 months she would get married. When the man began to read, his eyes climbed to his forehead in surprise. Mr. Kwan didn't understand how the schoolboy genius had persuaded his daughter to sign up for this. However, he was more surprised that the strategy smelled of a lot of money. The girl decided that her father did not take her decision seriously, but he asked to contact the guy to check the goods and pay for it. Hearing Chairman Kwan on the other side of the phone, Chester said that the option was not final, and he himself was going to invest more than $7,000. Investments themselves should have started accumulating as soon as the forecast worked. For the startup capital, Mr. Kwan chose a large amount, $1.5 million with a repayment period of 2 years and an interest rate of 40%. Chester was counting on half at most, but they seemed to understand each other perfectly. Casey was so glad that her father was willing to invest, so she enthusiastically exclaimed that she loved him. He was going to give this money to her anyway, so if it didn't work out, the girl would be left in the red. When she thanked her father and left, he asked her brother, Leon, a lawyer, to take on a case. The next morning, Detective Kim, as always, came to work, but as he climbed the stairs, he did not notice the stranger. He brought himself and his colleagues a kimbap, which he bought from Chester's mother. The guy had been helping his mother since early morning, and now it was rare to meet such people. The journalist saw on the porch that the employees were discussing something, so he went into the building. Buying coffee in the machine, he overheard that the excellent judoka single-handedly killed 7. Then the journalist took a few cups and approached the employees to find out the details. When Chester and his mother were working behind the counter, she asked her son if he really wanted to invest. If it hadn't worked out with the shares, he would have simply lost everything, not even leaving it to pay for the university. The only thing that calmed the woman was that the aunt of Chester's friend had invested a large amount, and she could talk to her herself. Mrs. Henson could not believe that her son had grown up so much. He had been an A at school, he had been engaged in judo, and he had also helped her. The guy was just a copy of his father and grew up just as good, so his mother asked him not to rush to grow up. At that moment, as she covered his palm with her hand, someone took a picture of them with a flash. The young man was not just a photographer, but a journalist named Paco, who wanted to interview Chester. The last time Chester had seen him, he had worn his glasses, and now he had taken them off, and it seemed that Paco's eyesight had completely deteriorated. The only thing the guy did not understand was why the journalist came to him, because there should have been no material for the article. Paco managed to get some information from Detective Kevin, so he came. Chester, anticipating his mother's reaction, cursed everything in the world, but continued to pretend that nothing had happened. Then the reporter said that her son did a worthy deed, single-handedly coping with a gang of criminals, and the woman flew into a rage. Mrs. Henson began to scream and beat her son for getting into a story again without thinking about it. Chester was angry with Paco because he came at the wrong time. The man was a good journalist, but he had no sense of tact at all. Now the guy was not eager to give an interview, but the newspaper still came out with a story about what happened. Finally, Chester translated all the materials related to training exercises. Paul Garland, Casey Kwan, and studying for exams. All this took more time than he thought. The coach pointed to the hand-walking exercise and asked the guy to explain what it meant. The essence of walking on hands was repetitive movements of the upper body, while the legs remained motionless. The next exercise was burpees. If an ordinary person can do about 50 sets, he risks meeting the angel of death. It is a rather grueling exercise that burns a large number of calories in a short time and is effective in improving endurance. Despite the fact that this is just a basis and not a complete technique, such movements give a good result. The coach decided that it would be a good idea to lead these exercises into their training, so he sent Chester to change clothes so that he could start the class as soon as possible. It was raining outside. It was good weather to sweat properly. When Chester and his coach entered the hall, the judokas immediately finished their warm-up and stood up to greet them. The man said that from that day on, there would be new exercises in their training, and the student next to him would play the role of an assistant. Chester was strenuously stretching, and the judokas wondered what the new instructor wanted to show them. In fact, he could have used these materials alone, but if they had mastered the technique that they would use in the future in advance, it could help not only their fellow athletes, but also the country in the development of judo. Chester has finished stretching, so it's time to get into a handheld walking position. In the second position, it was necessary to turn the body from a handstand and, relying only on one arm and legs, withstand your own weight. When the children saw this exercise, they began to doubt that they would be able to withstand it. It was easy for Chester to deal with him because his body was young and fresh, and he just had to watch his breathing, and then there was no problem. Such exercises were a little different from what the guys did every day, but the coach was sure that they would quickly get used to it. The judokas became sour, and the team captain had to make sure that everyone mastered the exercises before the start of the training camp. Chester knew he was in trouble now, but they had to thank him later. 3 hours later, the judo section was completely destroyed. The guys did not even have the strength to get up from the mats. It seems that the effect was not bad, but now, I did not know how to give all judokas a massage. Coach Sean would like to hire a professional massage therapist, but the budget for this was not enough, so it was worth being patient for a month or two. The team captain approached Chester and sincerely thanked him for training. Fees for the students of the course were in the first place, so he was pleased that his friend was in a hurry to translate the materials. Solomon, the captain of the judo team, was a first-class athlete who always won medals in competitions, but behaved modestly. It means that he understood and appreciated how effective the new way of training is. Saying goodbye, he wished Chester good luck and reminded him of the regular selection, which he could well get into. A regular selection was the selection of an honorary member of the section, selected to participate in various major competitions as a representative of his school. Such selection was carried out during winter and summer training camps, and only 5 were chosen among the 50 members of the section. Just in case, 5 more reserve athletes were also chosen, but it did not suit Chester to be a reserve. After a while, when the guy was getting ready for the road, his mother was very worried about him and the things that he could forget to put with him. Chester was an adult, so his mother bothered him more, for it had been very hot lately, and she had been standing outside all day selling kimbap. He asked her not to wear herself out too much, said goodbye, and hit the road. It was as if Chester had returned to the past yesterday, but in the meantime he had become so accustomed to this life. He trained hard for the sake of the training camp, so the time flew by. It was also necessary to rent a clean and tidy room for my mother as soon as possible, but for this his investment had to be earned. After returning, not everything went as he would have liked, but he was sure that events did not develop as before. Now he had to pull himself together and give his best to get rid of the wall that had hindered him in the past. Pablo was talking on the phone, convincing the man on the other side of the line that Sam was their trump card from the second year, and he would definitely pass the tests. He needed to push Sam into the regular tackle, and Chester only interfered with this task. Chester could only study since he got good grades, and was also on good terms with his elders, so there was nothing to complain about. In order to promote Sam and not forget about the high school students, the coach needed to remove the guy and deal with this before the start of the training camp. The guys climbed on the bus to take their seats, and Chester was sure that this time he would certainly get into the regular team. The guys drove along the road past the sea and were happy that they would train in such a beautiful place. The bus shook a little and he turned right towards the training center. The guys were already discussing how they would drink beer, several bottles of which they took with them. They invited Chester to sit with them in the evening to drink alcohol together, but he refused, deciding to focus entirely on sports. The reaction of the high school students was condemning, but the guy just put on headphones and continued to listen to music. Finally, the team of guys arrived at the place where they were to train for a whole month. Unloading their things, they noticed another bus with girls arriving in time and distracted themselves to watch. Coach Sean sighed heavily and pointed his finger forward. The judokas needed to change their clothes and run to the seashore. The punishment for the long training camp was a jog back and forth, and the coaches themselves went to install equipment for training. 5 minutes later, everyone was in shape and at a low start to run to the sea. Chester was the first to run to the shore, who himself was not sure of his ability to run. The coaches noted that he used to be strong, but he was not enough for a long time, and now he had both strength and endurance. Catching his breath, Chester saw a weight on the sand. He was running so fast, and now he had to train with a weight of 5 kilograms. Solomon ran second and, leaning on his friend, complimented him on setting records. Only Sam, who ran almost immediately after the captain, made a displeased expression on his face and spat contemptuously. Graduates who specially came to the training of judokas began to distribute 2 weights for each. No matter how much the guys wanted to, right on the seashore, they had to walk on their hands. The next was strength training in the gym, the equipment of which had to be rented by the coach. Chester hadn't thought they had prepared so thoroughly. There were so many machines that you would normally see in a fitness club. All this time, the guys were training without any equipment and simulators. They had only dumbbells or rubber bands with which they pumped their muscles. Coach Sean called his student instructor, who was located among the rest of the guys, to come up. It was necessary to show the others by example how to work with a barbell. Surprisingly, athletes had a lot of fears. Because their body is their state and their future, they could not try everything. A visual example and a demonstration of the use of new simulators would help to calm down the rest of the children a little. Chester felt that the pancakes on the barbell were too light, so despite the amazed looks of the coaches, he decided to add more weight. Coach Sean was worried that he could hurt his knees, because half of his own weight was enough for the newcomer. Only Coach Pablo decided to add fuel to the fire so that Chester understood where his place was and no longer subway to the regular team. He reassured his colleague that the athlete was familiar with the barbell and would cope with a larger weight. Pablo mentioned how Chester himself said that there would be no stress on the joints if you took the right position, and the guy began to suspect that he was inciting him, would disgrace himself in front of everyone by getting injured. To his great surprise, Chester took the position and pulled out the weight he had added to himself a few minutes earlier. Then Coach Sean asked him to help other guys, and the graduates, to record the results together with Coach Pablo. Chester was in great demand. Almost every second asked him to come over to check the position and technique. On his own initiative, he turned to Sam, a rubber bander, to help him increase the load. Through clenched teeth, he replied that he did not need permission to work out without a simulator. Probably the guy was very sensitive, and lifting the barbell was not used to him yet. As Chester walked away, the sophomore called Coach Pablo to make sure he was doing something. In a whisper, the man tried to reassure the judoka that the freshman would not be able to bypass him, so he should focus and think only about training. While helping his fellow sportsman, Chester noticed that the two were whispering to each other. There was a vague feeling that Sam and Coach Pablo were both a little hostile towards him, and it smelled like a conspiracy. Of course, Pablo, clenching his teeth with all his might, was angry that Chester could cause problems, and Sam risked not getting into the regular team. It was necessary to prevent this by any means, but he did not yet know how to do it. 2 weeks of training had passed, and some of them were still shaking from overexertion. Still, compared to last year, this time they at least trained properly. Sam did not agree with this at all. He believed that athletes were only wasting time and overexerting their muscles when they needed to prepare for sparring. He was worried about what this Coach Pablo was doing, because he promised that he would deal with everything. Coach Sean and Chester were talking during lunch in the cafeteria, sitting between Coach Pablo, so he made a remark to them. As he was about to put another spoonful of rice in his mouth, the man looked up and came across Sam, looking him straight in the eye. Without a sound, only moving his lips, the athlete asked if everything was going as it should, and Pablo choked, spitting everything back into the plate. Chester watched him these days and realized that the coach was behaving very strangely. The guy clearly felt that Coach Pablo, Sam, and a few other guys were trying to avoid him, and Sam was most likely to be hostile. About 10 people were connected with the coach and the athlete, and this is a fifth of the judo section. A trainer who turns others against Chester, and several judokas exchanging meaningful glances with him. All this was just a guy's assumption, but Pablo could really receive money from parents to promote their children in sports. But if this were true, the bribes could have greatly harmed the entire section, which in turn would have called into question their participation in major judo competitions. Perhaps Chester should have withdrawn from the competition before it was too late, as he would have been a sophomore in a year and could have competed for the regular team. If only he had refused to participate, nothing bad would have happened, but he did not want to miss the opportunity so easily. Discussing food from the cafeteria with his comrades, Sam was walking nonchalantly towards the corridor with a drink vending machine when he saw Chester buying his own coffee. He decided not to wait for the coach to do something and pile on the guy on his own. As soon as Chester heard one of the guys call out to Sam, the coffee fell out of his hands and fell to the floor. The guy tried not to pay attention to the approacher and took out a second jar for himself. Sam was still not going to retreat, and stepping on, he pretended that he accidentally caught him with his shoulder. But Chester turned around at that moment, and the apprentice fell on the first jar, and his companions were worried about him. They began to ask if he was all right, but Sam only began to swear violently as he rose. He decided that Chester considered him a simpleton and also mocked the elders and also dared to be impudent. Sam decided that the coach was too lenient with him, but in fact, Henson was completely distraught. At that moment, the coach entered, and the others realized that he would surely want to know what was going on here and parted. Sam asked him not to think anything of the sort, and explained that it was just that Chester was constantly arguing and not obeying his superiors. Pablo knew that the guy was up to something, for he grabbed Henson by the collar and asked them to finish and leave. The coach understood that he could not postpone it forever. Besides, it was time to work off the money that Sam gave him. He asked Chester to come out to talk to him alone, and then decided to call a second one to come with them. They went outside, and Henson didn't know what the conversation was going to be about, but it would be better to write it down just in case. Pablo was about to explain the reason why he had called them, but first he wanted to clarify that Chester was in the first grade. This means that his social life can still be frivolous and immature, although he is not a particularly rude and harsh guy. But even if in fact he is not like that, he can still get because of this, and this is hard to endure. Pablo saw that he was trying and looking for new materials for the judo club, and he knew that the coach understood everything. Still, he doesn't think it's time for Henson to show the same greed to become the best athlete to represent the school. The thirst for victory is good, but he is still a first grader, and you need to act like all first graders. The guy did not know that there is a rule that says that a first grader cannot become the best athlete and represent the school. The coach explained that Chester needed to make some concessions, and he said that if his skills were not enough, he would give up. Pablo noticed that he was too confident in his abilities and tried to explain his idea to him again. At this point, Sam could not stand it anymore and decided to intervene, indignant that he was constantly objecting to every phrase. The coach asked him to be quiet and explained that Chester would still have many opportunities before graduation, and his older teammates did not. He was a year younger, so he had to give in to them, but Henson decided that they were just intimidating him now. Pablo objected, but the guy realized that this was how he treated those who did not bribe him. Sam again stated that he only needed not to interfere with his elders and get out of their way, but instead he was just playing stupid. Chester didn't understand him, and he got even angrier, and then complained to the coach that he couldn't take it anymore. Henson said that Sam simply put pressure on the coach, and he does not understand why he emphasizes that he should give up his desire. After all, sending an athlete with an insufficient level of training will not bring anything good to the coach. Pablo could not stand it anymore and slapped him in the face, not understanding where such a rude and spoiled boy came from. The coach explained that if he continued to behave like this, then it would be better for him to just leave judo. Chester apologized for sounding rude, but he didn't understand why Pablo was insisting that he not claim. At that moment, Sam shouted that he had paid a bribe and enlisted the help of a coach with money. If Henson feels unfair, he can also pay if he has parents who can help. After all, he lives in a one-room apartment, and here he came to muddy the waters with his zeal for sports, and then Sam hit him. Pablo rushed to dismantle it and asked Sam to stop, reminding him that he could be expelled from the competition because of his antics. He began to shout that it was all because of him, and if the coach had worked off the money from the very beginning, he would not have had to do this. Pablo asked him to end there, and also asked Chester to forget everything Sam had said. A little farther away, Henson knew he had annoyed them a little, but he was able to get the information he needed. He will take care of his own life in the judo club and let the coach worry about his future. A little later, the guy packed his things. When he was met by Coach Sean, he could not understand why he was doing this and saying. Chester only thanked him because he had learned a lot under his guidance, but he did not understand why he was giving up judo. The director noticed that the guy had a bruise on his face and began to interrogate from whom he received, asking him to come into the room. There he suggested that the guy had been too hard in recent days, due to the fact that there was a lot of training, and Henson thought that he was not good enough. Sean realized that there was some other reason, thinking that something was mocking him, and the bruises were proof of that. The coach also decided that the student did not want to confess to him, because he did not trust him yet. Chester again assured that no one was bullying him, and then decided to provide him with his proof. He held out a tape recorder and asked me to listen to the tape and then decide whether to keep it or not. Pablo, meanwhile, thought that Chester was not going to resolve this situation, although he explained everything to him clearly. Then someone knocked on his door and announced from behind the door that the director wanted to see him, and the coach thought that something had happened. The man shared the news that Henson was going to leave the judo club, which Pablo couldn't believe right away. On the way, he thought that Chester was just crazy and had already said something to the director, and then he just decided to leave. In the office, he noticed that the atmosphere was very tense, and Henson was also there. Pablo asked him what had happened, and if something happened, he had to tell him first. The director called out to him, but the coach continued, noting that the guy's shoulders were too tense, and apparently this was due to stress. He advised Chester to relax, and all he needed to do was clear his head and concentrate on sports. The director called out to him even louder again, saying that Pablo himself had not yet understood what situation he was in. Then he called Solomon and asked him to come out with Henson for some fresh air. As he left, Chester mentally said goodbye to Pablo's coach, knowing that he wouldn't go far anyway. On the street, Solomon admitted that he had heard part of his story from the director and did not believe that Henson was going to retire from judo. The boy thought that he had not even thought about it, And Solomon expressed his understanding that he had been through a lot, and he should have said it earlier. Chester couldn't tell the whole truth and apologized for causing him trouble during this difficult period. The guy did not know what would happen next, so he decided to turn on the recording on the dictaphone, and that situation was recorded in detail. He had deliberately provoked him, of course, but Sam was much more excited about it than he thought. But still, Chester unexpectedly managed to obtain direct evidence of bribery. Now Solomon was about to leave and asked Henson to put himself in order and come back. The guy thanked him, and he wondered what Coach Pablo was going to do next. The headmaster, meanwhile, asked him to clarify who the headmaster really was, and he admitted that it was Sean. He confirmed this and then added that this is why the right to select athletes belongs to him. Pablo did not argue with him, and Sean demanded an explanation of how he had done this, and he realized that he was in such a situation because of this teenager. Still, he did not know how to explain everything to the director, only explain that he was not fair to him, and also all this was just a misunderstanding. Then Sean handed him a tape recorder and asked him not to even think of making excuses, and then turned on the recording. They had been together for 10 years, and Pablo began to ask permission so that he could continue to live and eat as before. The director was well aware of his small money that was transferred to him, so for his part, he turned a blind eye to it. But he shouldn't have crossed the line of his kindness and forbearance, and he also knows that he took money from many guys. If he left quietly, Sean wouldn't blow it up, and he wouldn't let other things go. It's his last show of respect for Pablo in his 10 years as a coach, and he knows he has the skills to teach. Therefore, Sean did not want to deprive him of the opportunity to continue growing in this direction, and hoped that he understood him correctly. When Pablo left, the director went out onto the balcony and thought, and still continued to look at the recorder. He had known the coach for 10 years, but if he hadn't figured him out, Chester might have really left judo. The director did not understand what kind of coach Pablo had come from, because from the very beginning he got away with everything. Now the fault was on him because of his negligence and the fact that he did not know how to distinguish between work and personal, and now he was ashamed. The next day, a general gathering was announced, and the director asked for the attention of all judokas. Finally, the day of the qualifying competitions has come, and the next 7 days will be fierce sparring. Sean believed that each of them was putting all of his strength into training before the qualifying tournament. But if they are not chosen, he asks not to be upset, because the goal is to enjoy the process of training and the selection itself. The principal then asked everyone to put in as much effort as possible, and the students agreed with him. Then he announced the beginning of a period of limitless sparring for the further selection of the representative athlete. Only 5 people, who are the first to score 70 victories, will be able to officially become representative athletes. Within a week, if an athlete does not get at least 10 victories per day, he is immediately eliminated. Then the judokas were asked to go to the mat, in the order in which their names would be called, and the winner then remained on the mat. The loser, therefore, waits for the next turn, and since there are only 5 representative seats, each must show what he is capable of. The director was wondering what kind of sparring Chester would show them this time, and he couldn't wait to see it. His rival urged himself not to be afraid, because they were both first graders, but the next moment Henson defeated him. He was declared the winner, and the guy was glad that now there were 69 victories left. The others were surprised that he had dealt with the opponent in just a few seconds, which seemed unsurpassed. Others understood that the next one would not be easy, so it was better to get up in sparring with him as rarely as possible. Sam was not afraid, because he had more experience, and they also wondered why Coach Pablo had left judo so suddenly, because his advice was now useful. It didn't please Sam that he had left suddenly without saying goodbye, and thought that Chester was involved. The director didn't say anything about the coach either, and neither he nor the other guys received any reprimand or anything like that. Sam hoped that this situation had nothing to do with what had happened that day, and at that time they began to announce the next in the group. He hoped that he would not be called, but his name was called out of spite, and the captain asked why he was standing and did not go to the mat. The guy realized that he could not disobey and soon stood in front of Chester, and they looked at each other. Sam tried to concentrate, because now the main thing is not the coach, but to defeat Henson and become a representative. Then they bowed to each other, and Sam believed that no matter how good he was, his experience was still on his side. The director was worried that even innocent employees could be involved, so he turned a blind eye to the bribery case. He called only Pablo to account, and thanks to this, the rest will be able to focus on the tournament. The case was not made public, but because of Chester, the judo club almost faltered, and now he needs to prove that he was worth the risks. They started sparring, and Sam thought that he would certainly win. And first he needed to find a gap in his defense. Then you need to penetrate this gap and use the technique, but Chester immediately blocked all his attacks. Sam couldn't find the moment to grab him by the collar, but the next moment there was a chance, and he grabbed Henson by the collar. He was glad, and now he had only to knock it over, but it turned out that Chester had been waiting for just that. Then he grabbed him with both hands, put a footrest, and knocked him to the floor using a special technique. Sam even coughed from the fall, and now he was angry at the realization that the enemy had opened up to him on purpose. Chester at this time was pleased that the throw over the hip went as it should. This is a technique when you need to raise the opponent's legs and break his pose. Then Henson held out his hand to Sam to thank him for the good sparring, but Sam only pushed her away. He kept getting angry and grumbling, and then he started to walk away and added that Chester was really a jerk. The guy was not angry because now he could forget about bribery. Besides, there were 68 victories left. Soon, the cohabitation with the guys was completed, and Chester was able to officially receive the title of athlete representative, which he wanted so much. Then he got a call and was offered to throw a party a little later to celebrate. The guy thanked him for the offer, but he still needs to go somewhere, and he promised to call back later. Passing by the police station, Chester decided to call Madame Kwan, asking how they were doing. She admitted that everything is still calm, but there is a slight feeling that danger is somewhere nearby, but only very little. Chester wondered if the purchase of investment products through Hong Kong paper companies was successful. The girl explained that there are no restrictions yet, so everything went well, and if everything works out, she will be able to return 30 times more. Henson said she did a great job at a time when global securities exchanges are starting to face bankruptcy. As when the Japanese bubble burst, Korea began to reduce or restrict sales of investment products in anticipation of bankruptcy. In order to take ownership of the goods in such a situation, Chester set up a paper company in Hong Kong. Fortunately, the purchase was successful just before the turning point, and the guy was glad that they had prepared in advance. Casey wondered if the shelf life of the product would be increased, but Henson explained that it wouldn't be that long anyway. To avoid a currency crisis, citizens gave away their gold rings and other valuables, eventually paying off the country's debt. If trouble struck, the Koreans would come to the defense of the country, and Chester asked Casey to trust her, as she had done so far. She agreed because then there was no one else to trust, and the guy asked to make a little more effort and try. As he hung up, Chester noticed that two comrades whom he had not seen for a long time were heading towards him. Sarah once again congratulated him on the title of representative athlete, and he admitted that this was thanks to their support. Then Chester suggested that we go further, and Shed's friend admitted that he was very worried. He also explained that he never thought that he would come to the police station for volunteer work. When they got inside, it was just lunch break time at the station, and almost all the employees had gathered in the canteen. One of them explained to the guys that they did not need to come here, but as soon as they left the station, they needed to turn left and move on. Chester decided to explain that they were not understood, and they came to volunteer on the recommendation of one person and gave the name. One policeman even stopped eating, realizing that they had come from a senior investigator, but admitted that they had arrived earlier than he thought. Then he introduced himself as Paul Brown and stated that he was the head of the police station in the area. He had heard about them from the senior investigator and had hoped for their hard work today. In the meeting room, before volunteering began, Paul decided to ask why they had come as volunteers. Usually, students do not come to them because they are afraid, but there is nothing wrong with that. Sarah admitted that she wanted to experience the everyday life of a police officer, and Shed thought that working here would be more meaningful and useful. Chester stated that he came because he wanted to be a police officer, which surprised Brown quite a bit. It has been his dream since childhood, and he wants to help lost children by showing them the right way. Chester also wanted to help elderly people in need during his volunteering. Paul explained that it would not be easy because the patrol is the prerogative of the police and he cannot trust the kids with this. But Chester also wanted to show that volunteering at the police station is useful and meaningful, and that police officers are kind and not scary people. He wanted to create a friendly image for the police station so that people would not be afraid to come here. The guy didn't want people to think that his dream he wanted to achieve was difficult, and Paul noticed the sincerity in this guy. After all, most students come here to clean, after which they immediately leave, but now I realize that this guy was definitely smart. After that, Brown agreed to give them 30 hours of volunteer work, and that would be enough since their safety came first. Then he asked one patrolman to give the guys the armbands of the patrol group, and they might also need walkie-talkies. Soon, the three friends were staffed and ready to go do the necessary work on the streets. After a while, Chester heard someone speaking Russian in the alley, and the phrases did not sound very friendly. Henson's friends were a little worried when they saw that he slowed down a little and decided that something had happened. The guy wanted to check what was happening there in any case, but he explained to his friends that he just needed to go to the toilet. Then Chester hid around the corner and tried to see from hiding what was going on in the cul-de-sac. He saw several people harassing a foreigner, and it was clear from their tone that their intentions were not entirely friendly. At that time, a pair of socks was sold at the market for 100 won, and underwear cost 200 won. Not long before, that foreigner was happy to have found the biggest market, so there must be good things here. Soon he had picked up everything in a row and was coming back with a few packages. He was pleased that there were a lot of purchases, and at that time some guy pestered him, saying that he had good things. The man explained that he had already bought a lot, but he did not lag behind, continuing to praise his product and even offered a discount. At that moment, a few more guys came up, and the foreigner realized that they weren't just going to have a friendly conversation with him. The main one repeated that his goods were the best, and a person only had to see, after which he could go on. Then he grabbed the foreigner by the neck, but immediately let him go so that he would not be too frightened and assured him that everything was fine. After that, the seller took a small bag out of his pocket and assured that he had definitely not tried this in his homeland. He began to guess what kind of substance it was, and the bandit explained that it was necessary to bring a souvenir from the trip home. At that moment, Chester decided to intervene and approached these hooligans to investigate, and they were outraged by his appearance. They didn't know who he was because none of them had seen his face before, and they decided that they should get rid of him. Then they noticed that he was wearing a patrol armband and decided that he was some kind of errand boy for the cops. Henson began to announce on the radio that there was one alleged victim and 4 criminals. He also asked to send help to the alley, but in response he heard a scream because he was only going to the toilet. The guy promised to tell all the details later, and now he explained that this place is to the right of the dumpling shop. The foreigner could not understand what was happening and who this guy was, and the bandits decided to quickly deal with this young man. Chester did not yet know exactly what the gang in the alley was up to, but he knew that he had to act, and he rushed to them. The bullies also prepared to attack him, but in the next moment, Henson pressed his head against the wall. From the blow, he began to lose consciousness and fell to the floor, and the others decided to attack Chester all together. The guy had to use only one trick for 2 more hooligans to end up on the ground. The head bandit was now standing confused, not understanding who this person was, and began to curse violently. Chester stated that they had something interesting there, and admitted that he was also interested in seeing it. The hooligan wanted to get rid of the approaching man as soon as possible and threw a brick at him, which was lying nearby on a pile of garbage. Henson held out his hand, and the brick shattered against his elbow, and the bully tried to escape by climbing over the fence. But he did not succeed, for Chester immediately seized him and began to pull him back, while he shouted for him to let him go. The guy fulfilled his wish and he flew down while doing a somersault in the air. The hooligan landed on bags of garbage, which managed to stink pretty much, and he even coughed from the stench. Chester immediately twisted his hands behind his back and told him not to do anything stupid and lie still. He also explained that he was detained for threats, as well as obstruction of justice. At that moment, an accompanying policeman appeared, who began to request a support group on the radio. Then he asked Henson what had happened, and Henson wanted to know where the other boys were. He admitted that he had sent them to the police station, and at that time, the foreigner, who had been silent until that time, decided to speak. He realized that these guys were from the police and asked him to explain what was going on, and Chester said that he would have to follow them. That hooligan fell out of his pocket during a fall, the same bag with a prohibited substance. Henson picked it up and said that they were drug dealers, the fight against which had been intensified since 1990. A little earlier, in 1976, it was decided to use marijuana only for medical purposes. But as the number of cases of abuse of harmful substances by teenagers increased, another law was passed. Soon at the police station, officers were surprised that someone decided to sell drugs in broad daylight. They were ordered to catch every single one of them and deal with them, and Chester added that those who produce drugs and sell drugs should also be captured. A little later, he was praised that Henson went volunteering and eventually attracted attention, preventing the incident. The investigator also recalled that since this case is related to drugs, the prosecutor's office should deal with this case. Chester explained that confirmation has not yet been received, and with this case, they will be able to raise the rating for solving crimes. The investigator still believed that the merit in this belonged exclusively to Chester, after which he asked to follow him. Then they met with Major Brown, whom the examining magistrate had not seen for a long time, as he had not often come here lately. He also asked to first check the evidence and then talk, and if the situation turns out to be serious, then they can have lunch while talking. He asked Chester to wait, and he went to the waiting room where he met Victor, the same Russian buyer. He hoped that the investigation was over and he could return, but the guy explained that, unfortunately, he would have to wait a little longer. Victor admitted that he did not even think that everything would become so difficult and confusing, because he already has a lot of things to do. Chester guessed that the reason he was busy was that he was looking for different business products. The foreigner was surprised how he found out, and the guy admitted that he was able to check his belongings, which he bought at the market. Victor admitted that he has not yet decided on the main product, so he needs to continue searching. Henson decided to inquire about his alleged product orientation, and he admitted that he was looking for something like doshirak. Chester realized that he needed something like instant noodles in a cup, and the foreigner confirmed it. The guy could not even think that doshirak began to gain popularity in Russia and decided to offer him coffee in cans. Victor did not understand what he meant, and Chester realized that such coffee had not yet become popular in that country. Apparently, this company has not yet entered the Russian market and wanted to try to convince the buyer now. The guy asked him to wait just 1 minute and came back with 2 cans of coffee, offering to try it. Henson hoped that he would like it, and when Victor took a sip, he was amazed, not understanding what it was. Chester explained that this is a very popular product in Korea and invited a foreigner to find a similar product for him to sell. Victor did not understand how this guy could help him, and he wanted to recommend products that Russians might like. The buyer was even more surprised, not understanding how he could know about the preferences of the Russian people, because he is an ordinary schoolboy. Then Henson decided to explain to him the example of this coffee, and if he brought it to Russia, then the sales would not be very successful. In that country, this cold drink in a can will instantly freeze in the fierce Russian cold. But there's also a workaround, and if Victor can guarantee Chester 3% of the profits, he's willing to share a solution to the problem. His proposal also does not require an instant response, and Henson gave him time to think before the investigation of the incident was completed. Soon, the investigators team and the police department teamed up and caught the remaining gang members who were trying to sell drugs to Victor. All drug gangs in the area were also arrested, and newspaper headlines were full of reports of gang arrests. Chester, meanwhile, after signing a contract with Victor, went with him in search of additional goods to export to Russia. He was even a little sorry, because if they had a little more time, they would have been able to collect more goods. But Victor had enough of what he already had, and if it hadn't been for Henson, he wouldn't have been able to get such good goods. He especially liked that oven, a device that keeps drinks warm. This is a really worthwhile thing. The guy was glad that he was satisfied, and then admitted that he had another small gift for the foreigner. Chester clarified who their president is, And in the election camp, they have one very difficult person, so you need to make friends with him. Russia is also facing a harsh winter soon, and Henson, as a consultant, advised Victor to gain more weight. The guy admitted that Korea was about to fall, but in a couple of years at most it would rise again, and he believed that the whole world would be amazed at this. Victor admitted that his advice is really worth $300,000 for a consultation. What he bought at the lowest price in this country characterizes their relationship, and although it is the cheapest, it is also very valuable to him. Chester noticed that he continued to praise him, as if they would never see each other again. Victor assured that the next time they saw each other, he would gain as much weight as possible, after which they said goodbye. This is how Chester acquired connections in Russia, and if everything works out, then there is a possibility of future cooperation with this country. Then the guy called one number and explained that perhaps Russia would soon declare a moratorium, and at the earliest it would be at the end of this year. At the latest it could happen within the next year, and he admitted that he learned it from a Russian friend. The guy on the other end of the line believed that a moratorium was equivalent to national bankruptcy, and besides, inflation was very serious. Chester also found it hard to believe, but this was not like the standard methods of others, and asked about investments. It was explained to him that this was unlikely to bring good results, although there was a possibility, and Henson asked for action. Autumn was in full swing, and now that Victor was gone, Chester could start preparing for the national competitions. High school students, and other citizens gathered from all over the country for a sports competition. There, everyone who diligently trains for this day in his skill competes with others like him. The judo team arrived by bus in another city and were happy that they were finally here at the national competitions. At the parking lot, 5 athletes saw that there were a lot of buses, which meant a large number of other participants and spectators. The director asked that if everyone got off the bus, then they should hurry, and the guys wanted to get to the dormitory as soon as possible and rest. When they arrived at the place, they were a little disappointed and even doubted that there was at least water here. One guy began to ask to change their place to spend the night, but they explained to him that there was no money for this since they did not allocate an additional budget. The director asked them to stop grumbling and reminded them that the opening ceremony of the competition would begin tonight. He asked them to wait quietly in their seats, adding that if they smelled anything, they would be immediately disqualified. Chester also saw that the condition of the place to spend the night was much worse than he thought, and apparently someone played a cruel joke on the budget. Then the guy called Casey again, apologizing for the sudden call and admitting that he had an urgent request for her. He asked to get part of the profits from the product he invested in, and the girl became worried, thinking that something had happened. Henson needed only a small amount of money, and then whispered that they could come to an agreement. 5 minutes later, the principal learned that the students wanted to change their place of stay, and Chester explained that he had contacted his sponsor. Also, that person will cover all the living expenses of their team, after which he pretended that the sponsor wanted to talk to the director in person. Coach Sean introduced himself immediately, and then, after listening to the girl, began to sincerely thank her. Henson later explained that the cost of living would be covered, as well as breakfast, lunch, and dinner, as he had doubts about the condition of the local canteen. After a while, they arrived at a very nice hotel, and some of them were in such a place for the first time. The director also admitted that the place was just excellent, but he understood that even so, the allocated amount should not be too large. Chester reassured him that he was a wealthy man who sponsored him personally, so there was no need to worry. The headmaster thought she was from a well-to-do family, and then Henson whispered in his ear how much she earned a month. He was surprised, and the guy asked him not to worry, because she supports and sponsors him really sincerely. At the same time, Chester understood that now he had to repay her with as good results as her help and support. Soon, teams began to gather in the arena for competitions, and each of them hoped to win this competition. Solomon was the first to come out of these judokas, and the others shouted words of support to him, adding that if he lost, they would evict him from the room. The captain of the team did not play with his opponent for a long time, and soon defeated him in the round. Returning back, he admitted that the guys made him laugh a lot, and because of this, he almost lost. Chester stated that he had won anyway, and Solomon admitted that the longer they had known each other, the more he felt that he was cunning. Then it was announced over the loudspeaker that the qualifying stage was beginning, and Henson knew that it was his turn. The captain nudged him and said that if he didn't win today, he would have a special training. When he entered the ring, the opponent for some reason asked why he was not going to lower his eyes. Then the whistle sounded and they grappled, and a few seconds later, Chester put his opponent on his shoulder blades. Everyone was quite surprised that this guy managed to do it so quickly. After all, he really won in the blink of an eye. Then more rounds began, and Chester got 4 more wins, and his friends were only surprised at his speed. The director was also a little shocked. He even suggested that Henson wanted to set a record. But the guy suddenly asked if he could participate in competitions as a simple athlete, and not from the school. Sean was surprised, but he admitted that Chester would be good enough in competition as an individual athlete. At the same time, Henson realized that he had finished too quickly, which made him a little bored, and now he wanted to compete with stronger people. High school is already too easy for him, and he wants to compete with athletes of the same level as him as quickly as possible. The guy began to compete again, and he now came across opponents a little stronger, but he also easily defeated all of them. His friends praised him for doing a good job, for he had defeated every opponent in 16 seconds, which was incredible. Chester modestly explained that they had all done a good job, for which the captain liked him even more, and he even climbed up to hug him. One guy remarked that the competition was over, and it would be a shame to just leave, and Solomon realized that they hadn't even seen the sea. Chester thought for a moment that he still had time to see Stan, and decided to do it somehow. Then he invited the others to eat sashimi at the seafood market, and they were glad that they could go to the coast. At the market, each seller tried to lure them away, declaring that they were either tastier or cheaper than the rest. The guys were still surprised that the products were very expensive here, and the captain offered to calculate the budget. But even altogether, the money was not so much, and Solomon doubted that they would have enough even for the cheapest. Chester took the money in his hands and said that it was enough, and asked them to trust him, and he would make sure that everyone was full. They agreed, and Henson decided to immediately find a shop called Haley's, and soon he was able to see it. A fat man suddenly appeared in front of him, who began to grumble that he had blocked his way. Immediately, a young woman approached the fat man, explaining that if he took all the money, then she would not be able to trade today. The man pushed her hand away and said that if she borrowed, she should give it back, and she asked to keep it at least for today's trade. Immediately, a guy appeared who stood up for the woman, and the fat man only got angrier that he dared to open his mouth. He thought that this young man wanted to die and immediately waved his hand at him, intending to teach him a lesson. The woman was immediately indignant that he decided to hit the child, and at that moment Chester spoke to her. The guy asked how much 1 kilogram of flounder she had, and the fat man immediately said that the store was not working. The woman apologized for the circumstances and asked him to come back another time, but Henson didn't understand why she couldn't sell to him today. The fat man again began to threaten the newcomer that he would hit him, but immediately got a kick in the shin. He began to call the guy names, and he realized that he was a usurer who knocked out funds illegally. Then Chester explained to him that if he had finished, that he should get out of here, and the peasant did not dare to argue with him any further. As he left, he only grumbled that this guy was lucky today, and he again asked his aunt if she could sell him at least a perch. Then he noticed the boy and noticed that he was still a little boy at that time, and his mother was very beautiful. The boy asked Chester if he was a gangster, and he admitted that gangsters are the people he hates the most. To the young man, he still seemed like a gangster, and he did not argue, allowing him to think as he pleased. The boy wanted to know who he was, if not a gangster, because he made that nasty uncle run away. Chester explained that he is a high school student who practices judo, and if he is interested, he will be able to see it on television in November. Henson also explained that in order to protect someone, he needed to become stronger than he was now, and asked him to start by studying hard. After a while, the judokas ate and did not think that they would be able to eat so much. The captain wondered if Henson had been on television, because he had told the boy to watch it on television. Chester recalled that the broadcast of the competition should be broadcast on TV, and Solomon understood what he meant. Henson remembered that Stan had come to work for the police after the exam, and had hoped that studying hard would help him do so now. A month later, the broadcast began, and Chester's mother and her friends also gathered to watch the competition. Mrs. Henson prayed that her son would finish well, and that he would not hurt himself and return home. The presenter began to say that the athlete Chester has a unique biography and skills because he defeated his opponent in 20 seconds. Therefore, he was given the nickname Fast Chester, and it was the emergence of a new star who would lead Korean Judo. In addition, there are rumors that he is good not only in sports, but also in studies, because the guy has excellent grades, and this is really the birth of a star. Then they began to show the competitions themselves, where Henson coped with his opponents quite easily. At the final round, the guy noticed that his opponent for some reason continued to run away, because time was running out. He decided that this guy had run out of strength from the push at the very beginning, and he knew that it was time to deal with him. Chester pounced on him and explained that his strength and endurance only waned over time, and then knocked him to the floor. The whistle sounded, and Henson was declared the winner, with the commentator saying that it was all over in the blink of an eye as soon as they collided. The director was overjoyed and immediately rushed to hug the student because he won a gold medal at the Presidential Judo Championship. The guy shouted into his mother's camera that her son had become a national athlete, and it was a historic moment. Then the host approached him, who congratulated him on his victory, adding that his victories were more like stories from the movies. Chester admitted that he was happy because he trained under careful guidance, surrounded by caring guys. Then he again addressed his mother through the cell and asked her to wait for her son, because they would definitely celebrate his victory with a dinner with meat. Then the host asked if it was difficult for him to devote time to both sports and study, because he is known for his academic performance. Henson thought of Stan now, hoping that he was watching the air, because he had prepared a speech especially for him. Then he explained that everything is not easy, but everything depends on willpower and desire, and if there is a desire, you can cope with anything. The host liked this answer, and then he asked what dream Chester wanted to fulfill with his strong will. At the moment, he wants to get a gold medal and then enroll in a police academy or law school. Steen's mother remarked that the boy's mother was already happy, and his father said that it would be good if such a smart guy became a prosecutor. Stan asked him not to think of Chester as his younger colleague, because it was better to concentrate on family matters. The guy did not understand why he did not feel sorry for the tirelessly working children and their mother, and did not understand what was the use of his work as a prosecutor in such a case. Then the boy hugged his brother and sister and continued to watch the broadcast of the championship. He had heard Chester talk about his dream, and then he remembered his advice that he needed to be stronger than he was now, and to do well in school. When Stan heard about willpower and desire, he decided that he too would pull himself together and start studying hard, as well as definitely become stronger. In November of the same year, concerns about heating costs intensified due to the growing cold, because winter came earlier than expected. In the end, the government announced that it had decided to seek financial assistance from the International Monetary Fund. Then the president began to speak, who admitted that he was very uncomfortable in front of the Korean people. People did not understand what he was talking about at all, because they were asked to trust only the government, and they did not understand what was happening now. Chester heard all this indignation and dialed Madame Kwan's number again, after which he asked her to act as the time had come. The Korean economy was literally overwhelmed by a wave of severe cold, and companies built on debt began to collapse one after another. Banks that had engaged in usury with dollar debts also went bankrupt, and small businesses collapsed. Later, Chester and Sarah went to his longtime friend Jessie, who was surprised that the girl also came. She did not understand that this small Meleg, as if he was not happy to see her, and wondered why he had invited only Chester. At the same time, Henson noticed that Jessie lived in such houses, while hoping that his gift would not upset him, and reached into his pocket. Then he thanked him for the invitation and handed him an envelope containing exchange coupons for kerosene and coupons for the store. Chester explained that his sponsor had sent it for Christmas, but he already had too many coupons and hoped that his friend would now accept them. Now, Jessie understood why he wanted to see him so much, and he thanked him, explaining that his mother would be very happy. Chester also added that they are friends, and in difficult situations they should help each other. Then Sarah asked why they were not coming, since she did not know the way, and asked Jessie to go first. Immediately, two strange young men appeared in front of her face, who began to wonder where she was going. The girl immediately hit them and then returned to her friends, saying that these men seemed abnormal to her. But Jesse recognized them, and after greeting them, he asked what they were doing here. He then explained to his friends that these young people lived in his neighborhood and were training to become idols. One of them admitted that the water supply in the dormitory had burst, and they were pretty tired of the fact that now it was impossible even to wash. These guys and their way of speaking seemed very familiar to Chester, and then he remembered that their band would be very popular in the future. Now Henson couldn't understand why they were in such a neglected state, and at that moment, one of them, Jason, began to lose consciousness. His comrade barely had time to pick him up, and then carefully laid him on the floor, and admitted that he had complained of weakness in the morning. Sarah immediately prepared to call an ambulance, and Chester tried to bring him to his senses for the time being. Jason's friend suggested that he could have been infected by trainees, who had a constant cough and blood from their mouths. Hearing this, Henson was very worried, realizing what kind of illness it could be. Soon, Jason was brought to the hospital, and the doctor explained that it was not tuberculosis, but he had lost consciousness due to colds and malnutrition. His friend was still worried, explaining that he did not cough up blood, and the doctor explained that he lacked nutrients. Chester was glad it wasn't TB, but advised the rest of the trainees to go to the hospital and get tested. Jason's friend understood that this had to be done, but admitted that they had little money, and also blamed himself for the fact that they were sick. He knew so little here since he lived in America, and he thought that it was hard for all the trainees because of him. Suddenly, Jesse handed the man an envelope with coupons, explaining that he needed it much more, and the man was surprised. The boy also apologized to Chester because it was his gift, but Henson, on the contrary, was only glad. The young man could not believe that he was given so many coupons, and it was explained to him that it was such a gift. He decided to share the news with his unconscious friend right away, that they didn't have to worry about heating bills yet. After a while, the three friends ate hot cakes, and Jesse explained that it would taste much better if they were eaten with milk. Chester thought that this boy had reminded him of an important truth, a willingness to share with someone in need, even if he didn't have much himself. He even paused, lost in thought, and his friends worried that something had happened. Henson explained that it had been cool, and now he was very pleased that the sun was shining again. He understood that, thanks to the affection and solidarity of Koreans, people would be able to find strength in a difficult situation for the country. A little later, he went with his mother to hand over her wedding ring, which she could not just leave lying around. Chester's late father would have understood such an act, because it is better to use the ring more meaningfully. Then Henson agreed to do so if his mother herself did not mind, and at that moment a man came up to them. It was a reporter. He recognized Chester as a rising star and asked for permission to conduct an interview. As an active national spokesman, Henson is involved in a gold collection campaign, and a reporter asked if he would be handing over his medals. The guy said that he could do it. He decided that 2 gold medals from the competition could be useful. Of course, they matter to him, but he can win more, and then he confessed that his mother is also here to hand over the wedding ring. The reporter thought she was a great woman, because this thing must have meant a lot to her. Chester remembered that she had raised him alone in a cramped room, and now the story of his family was known. Then they returned home, and the mother asked him to go first and rest, but the son suggested that she dine together. She explained that she had to come early and get ready for the working day, and Chester had a day off, so he could go out with friends. Then Matushka added that he had been a great fellow today, even more so than when he won the gold medal. Then she decided to leave, and the guy realized that even on a day like today, she did not rest. Chester received a call from reporter Max, admitting that he had seen him on the news and complimenting his mother. Also, if Henson wins a gold medal at the Asian Games, he will become a real national hero. He also praised him for participating in the gold collection, because with such an incentive, their country will be very able to pay off its debts and rise. Chester agreed, but he wondered how the country treated gold collected in this way. He hoped that the state would not thoughtlessly use those things that meant a lot to citizens. The reporter imagined an article that the gold had been sold on the cheap, without gaining international recognition through the major trading companies. Chester immediately stated that he blurted out without thinking and decided to seek advice from reporters he could trust. The guy decided to change the direction of the case this time because various unaccounted-for factors may arise in such a matter. A little later, he met with Casey and Paul, and she expressed hope for productive work together in the future. She also asked her boss to do what he usually did, and he remembered that he had also sacrificed his business today. Casey suggested that Chester had foreseen this situation and determined that it would not last long. The guy modestly explained that he was not a prophet, and the girl reminded that they were able to earn a lot of money without any support. Paul objected because how many politicians got into the investment arena thanks to them? In addition, their boss has an influential friend from Russia, but Casey admitted that this is the first time she has heard about it. The guy with glasses said that their boss was now in the top 1% assets anyway, so nothing could touch them. Chester realized that the two were very worried and promised that he would be able to arrange a shield for them. He explained that even if their company was exposed, it would be pointless to attack them. Starting tomorrow, Henson will have an important task: to install this very shield in the most necessary place. At the National Training Center, the students were surprised that this coach led 2 high school students to victory at the national level. They didn't understand why he was behind the coach, and also remembered that his name was definitely Chester, and he was a rookie monster. Then Director Sean introduced himself to them and said that he intended to win a gold medal since their country was in a crisis situation. He also needed their active cooperation and asked them to introduce themselves in order from junior to senior. Chester, meanwhile, thought that this was the place where they would place the shield of their company. Then he went out and introduced himself to the others. He took the position of coach on the recommendation of Coach Sean, and he will also list Quan and Park in the list of companies. 10 months later, the team was leaving the airport, and a reporter immediately began asking what their goal was at the Asian Games. The director explained that he wants to do everything possible to bring Korea as many gold medals as possible. Then Chester, as the youngest national judoka, was also asked to say something, and he said that he would return only with a gold medal. After making a transfer, they then flew to the airport in Bangkok, where everything seemed very spacious to them. Solomon confessed to Henson that it was his first time abroad, and Chester shouted at the others to quickly find their luggage and return to the group. A guy asked in English where the second exit was, and Henson explained that he had to go straight to the toilet and that exit was nearby. Solomon remarked that Chester also had an excellent command of English, remembering that he had also read an English newspaper on the plane. The others agreed that he should learn from him, and Henson realized that the rumors were full of energy, as athletes should. The director later recalled that when they go to the hotel, they will encounter many foreign athletes who compete. He also asked the children not to forget about the blood and sweat that they shed to become unsurpassed. They should always remember that they are athletes that Korea is proud of, and they agreed with him. On the way, Chester didn't understand why it was so hot here, because it was December, and then he almost ran into a girl. They didn't say anything to each other, and that blonde just hurried on her way, and the guy just looked after her. But then she looked back, and when their eyes met, Chester felt his cheeks begin to turn red. His comrades tore him away from his thoughts, who asked why he had stopped, and he hurried to catch up with them. Moving a little further, this blonde called someone on the phone and stated that the first contact had been successfully completed. At the hotel, the guys went for a massage, which refreshed them well, and Chester advised Solomon to go there again if he liked it so much. Henson himself was going to drink coffee and then go to the room, and when he entered the restaurant, he noticed the same blonde there. The girl noticed him too and only smiled sweetly at him, after which she raised her cup, thus inviting him to sit down next to him. The guy felt his cheeks burn again, but he understood that he had to pull himself together immediately. Approaching the table, Chester sat down, and the first thing he asked the girl was that she could be one of those who are with men for money. He did not understand why she needed all this, and explained that she should not behave like this with athletes. He realized that she tried to be remembered from the first meeting. During the second, she was clearly planning to let his guard down, and then a waiter approached them, asking what they would order. Chester asked for coffee, while realizing that at the third meeting, the blonde would begin to fulfill her mission, pretending that it was an accident. The girl stated that it was quite unpleasant, and she did not understand why he sat down next to her just to say such rude things to her. But Chester just asked her not to use men for her own purposes. He understood that she was ordered to get close to an Asian man. He also began to list the countries for which she works, and suddenly the blonde clapped her hands, acknowledging his amazing prudence. Then this girl introduced herself as Natalia Vodianova and explained that she was a KGB agent, which shocked Henson. Still, he realized that Victor had made a lot of money, since he himself had interested such people from Russia. The girl then wondered how he was able to expose her, and Chester admitted that he was just an attentive and cautious person. The blonde hoped that he also guessed why she turned to him, and he decided that it was because of the good results from the moratorium. Natalia was surprised. She was told that he was a genius who foresaw the rule of Korea as a 17-year-old teenager. Then she decided to get straight to the point and asked if he was going to obtain Russian citizenship. The guy was surprised by such a question, but said that he was not going to leave his country yet. Then Natalia decided to ask him one last question. She wanted to know how he was able to predict the Russian moratorium. The guy could not admit to her that he saw it in the future and explained that a line stretched from the Russian Empire to the Soviet Union, recklessness. It manifested itself in the refusal to bow and break through by any means, while most Korean companies did not leave, as they believed in the strength of Russia. The girl noticed that although the guy was young, he definitely had intelligence and insight, and she used to think that someone was behind him. Then she said that he would be guaranteed Russian citizenship and land, as well as a huge lifetime pension. Chester said that he was not interested in it at all, but the girl insisted that he think it over and let it know. Henson explained that he had business in Korea, and now the blonde realized that his goal was not money, because money is just a tool. With the help of this tool, the guy will be able to catch one villain, as well as his entire gang. Then Natalia realized that he had his own reasons for this and asked if he was against just being friends. He assumed that this was a business friendship, and the girl would like to say that it was not, but she understood that he would not believe her. Henson admitted that he had heard about the bad reputation of the KGB, after which he offered to shake hands in honor of their friendship. But then the girl leaned over to him and kissed him on the cheek, from which the guy again felt that the blood rushed to his face. Natalia explained that this is such a Russian farewell for loved ones, and then promised to send him a gift in honor of their friendship. The next day, at the National Stadium in Bangkok, the coach was asked why he was sad on such a day. Solomon admitted that Chester had given him the works at the end of the day yesterday and asked him to smile because they were being filmed. The gift from Natalia was a huge amount of material related to rival countries, so Henson did not have time for a massage. The rest of the athletes, who also looked through the material, noticed that there is a lot of useful information there. Chester thought that this time there would be legendary players like a marathon runner and a baseball player. He wanted to get their autographs, but then the captain explained that it was their turn and they needed to get ready to leave. The judokas with the whole team went to the middle of the stadium, where the opening ceremony of the Asian Games was taking place. This ceremony begins with the athletes from each country coming out, at which point athletes from South Korea appear. Henson looked up at the sky, and the weather seemed dazzlingly bright to him now. After that, they went to lunch, where there were many delicious dishes, and the captain wished everyone bon appetit. At the same time, Chester was happy that thanks to Kwon, he could eat Korean food even in Thailand. The director asked Solomon why Korean food was not included in the standard configuration. Henson also didn't understand how they could have everything but Korean food, as if someone had deliberately excluded it from the service. Then the guy asked not to worry, because his sponsor promised to deliver food to them daily by air. One guy said that he wanted to eat at least one spoonful of homemade soup to satisfy his hunger, and a friend asked him not to disgrace himself. Chester noticed the canoe team at the other table. They were also defending the honor of their country, and he wanted to invite them to join in the meal. Then the director took one dish, and when he approached those guys, he explained that they had a lot of food and offered to join. Their captain thanked them for the information they were given last time, but they would be very embarrassed to take food as well. Coach Sean explained that they have a lot of food, so there is no need to worry because the Koreans should help each other. Then the rowing team decided to happily accept it, and Chester was glad again that his coach was so kind. Soon the competition began, and when Solomon entered the arena, the director asked him not to hesitate, and Chester recalled the conversation before the competition. The captain remembered that his opponent had a habit of grabbing his collar and then immediately attacking, at which point he had to attack first. It's a winning strategy that Solomon should use in today's competition, and he soon did the right thing. Then he was declared the winner of the round, and the director and Henson were happy for him. He ran up to them and they began to hug him in honor of the victory, and he admitted that he had passed the preliminary selection thanks to them. Chester explained that it was all because he had followed the instructions and tried, but this was only the beginning, and for some reason he was already crying. Some time later, the last couple remained, and it was Henson's turn to enter the arena. But when he came out, he saw that his opponent was very tall, 2 meters tall, and also very broad-shouldered. It was an athlete from Japan, Jack Morgan. Even the commentator noticed that he was quite large, weighing 140 kilograms. They wondered if Chester could survive the duel without the level restrictions on the monster battlefield. The guy immediately tried to grab him by the collar, but suddenly he got his fist, and the Japanese only grinned. Henson realized that this fighter was good at dirty games and decided to use another move, grabbing him by the painful point. He immediately screamed in pain, and suddenly their fight was stopped, and Chester did not understand why. He began to explain that it was not on purpose, and the judge told him that if it happened again, he would be disqualified. The Japanese was surprised that the Korean would only be given a verbal warning and said that he specifically wanted to put pressure on the collarbone. Such a technique was a violation that could not be protested, even if the athlete was disqualified. In the materials that Natalia gave, the judge of this competition is very limited in his decisions. The Japanese began to threaten that he would take out Chester with one blow, and he explained because he thought that he liked dirty games. Then the guy noticed that this thug was nervous and his movements were too sweeping. Then Henson seized the moment and, tripping him, was able to grab him with his hands and knock him to the floor. The whistle sounded and the round was announced, and the Japanese sat shocked by what had happened, like many spectators. After that, rugby competitions began and many cheered for these guys, and they tried to win. As a result, the Korean canoe team exceeded all expectations and took first place, which many fans were very happy about. After a while, the judokas were happy that all the teams from their country did well, and the captain admitted that he really liked the sport of canoeing. Suddenly there was a knock at their door, and they did not understand who could have come at such a late hour, and Chester went to open it. A man and a young guy who introduced himself as an interpreter from Thai, and the man was a judo coach, were outside the door. Henson asked what they were talking about, and the boy translated that the Thai coach thought it was too much. The athletes of their national team live on the floor below and cannot have a normal rest because they are very noisy. Chester apologized, realizing that they made a fuss when they supported athletes from their home country. Then he asked the captain to bring him a box of red ginseng, and he immediately complied with his request. Solomon could not understand what was going on, and Chester explained that these people lived below and that they had made them uncomfortable with the noise. Then the guy apologized to the coach again and asked him to take the package as an apology. The Thai trainer was surprised by red ginseng, which is the most well-known health product in Korea. Henson admitted that it is expensive but very effective, and it is a food supplement that has nothing to do with doping. Then the Thai coach thanked for the gift, but asked them to be more cautious in the future. When they had gone, the captain was surprised that Chester was doing well in social life. The guy explained that almost all stages in all disciplines are over, and now the participants will begin to gradually remove opponents. In such a situation, it is better to win allies, not enemies, and the rest of the guys supported that it was a great idea. Henson remembered that the representative of Thailand was that Thai judo monster. This is the athlete who should be feared the most in these competitions. Soon, the Korean national team passed the qualifying stage in all weight categories, and one person did not understand how it happened. He was informed that, at his request, they had removed Korean cuisine from the menu, and the team was also placed on a floor with low water pressure. After all, they were supposed to become weaker without their food, but it became known that the Korean national team was separately sponsored by a Korean company. The man with glasses did not understand what such a terrible thing would happen, if they did not eat this garlic rubbish. He was asked to calm down, and it was realized that now it was necessary to prohibit the import of food from outside, and he explained that there could be problems with the government. If a scandal flares up from this, then nothing good will come of it, and then the main one proposed to act differently. Korean athletes who show good results will be disqualified, and there is one way to do this. In the evening, Chester could not understand why the water pressure in this room was so weak. Someone knocked on his door again, and he was surprised, because they were no longer noisy, but he went to check who had come. Two guys in uniform and with red suitcases entered the room, and without saying a word, they began to prepare. Then one of them stated that this team was temporarily forbidden to leave the room, but Chester did not understand what was happening. The man then explained that all athletes of the Korean judo team would be tested for doping. Henson saw a special cup, and he did not expect that it could be tested in such a way. After a while, they entered the ring again, and Chester, as always, defeated his opponent. Continuing to think about this incident, the guy became more and more angry, not understanding who could have given them a tip. Someone tries to remove them in this way and condemn the results of their hard work in judo, something Chester cannot forgive. The guy went to the film crew, and his comrades did not understand what he was up to and asked to return to them. Henson suddenly opened his kimono and began to shout that these cowardly guys could not harm them like this. Then he took off his shirt and kept yelling for them to attack one by one, calling them cowardly creatures. He also began to shout that doping is nonsense and his body cannot be made of doping. Commentators did not understand what was happening now and suggested that Chester was trying to dispute something. The spectators at the stadium also did not understand what was happening and why it was doping, and Henson continued to shout. The director only grabbed his head, but he understood that this guy was not doing anything just like that. These shots, when Henson was screaming, were seen by his mother on TV, and she was very worried. Later, the director decided to talk to him on the bus and began to shout at him that he was out of his mind, and he explained that he was just very angry. Sean still shouted that he was almost disqualified, and they were lucky that they got off with a simple warning. Chester said that the organizers also made a mistake, so they made a simple warning. Sean agreed that he was right, and it seemed that someone was inciting them to such actions. In any case, there was nothing good in his actions, and the director asked Chester not to do it again. Henson agreed and asked not to worry, because he understood everything perfectly, thinking that the members of the committee were also nervous now. With more attention being paid to the Asian Games, journalists should investigate and the committee should look into the situation. Chester could not believe that they began to check not one athlete, but an entire judo team, and apparently the case was clearly unclean. Then Henson asked the headmaster to let him go out, and the headmaster asked him not to do any more work. On the street, the guy met with the others, and the captain interrogated what the director said and whether he had imposed any punishment, and he assured that everything was fine. Then Chester explained that he needed some air, and asked his friends not to worry if they saw that they were worried again. A little farther away, Henson dialed his mother's number and asked how she was doing. She explained that she was fine, and she was very much looking forward to his call, because she had seen the news on TV and did not understand what kind of doping. The guy explained that her son is just such a good guy that even in another country they envy him, so they are trying to find something to complain about. He asked her not to worry because she knew him and she agreed, and then she was going to hang up so that he would not be too expensive for the call. She also asked him to dress warmly, and when he passed out, Henson didn't know why it was cold if it was a hot country. Then he began to think about where to start the investigation, and then he noticed the Japanese judo team. Among them was the same thug with whom Chester had recently had to fight. The guy thought of him, but decided that he shouldn't suspect when he was so emotional. That huge Japanese guy suddenly called Henson doping, obviously mocking him so much, and he didn't like it. Morgan did not understand why he was looking at him like that, and then asked the others to leave so that the doping would not be passed on to them. Chester clenched his fist, knowing what they were talking about, and then he noticed that the thug was trying to hide the bald spots. He also wondered why the area around his neck was so red, and he began to guess what was going on. At that moment, someone called him and the number was unknown to the guy, but still he picked up the phone. It was Natalia, who asked if her new friend was okay, and Chester was genuinely surprised by her call. Still, he realized that she was calling, since he was aware of the situation, and admitted that in fact, everything was not quite right. The girl then offered him her help, reminding him that they were now friends, and Henson thought about it. A little later in a cafe, some guy was thinking about why he had been personally contacted by this nasty KGB. He didn't know what it was about, although he had a couple of assumptions, and decided that he didn't have to worry. At that moment, he was approached by Chester, who introduced himself as the coach and athlete of the Korean judo team. The guy greeted him and then explained that he was waiting for someone here, but asked what business he had come for. Henson just sat down at the table in silence, but then confessed to the man that it was quite difficult to meet him, so he asked a friend for help. The boy realized that he meant a KGB agent, and realized that he probably had a request or a case for him. Then he suddenly got up and said that he had nothing to talk about with him, and then he was about to leave. Chester asked him to sit down again, adding that he was just wondering how much he had received from the Japanese side. Then Henson put the tape on the table and said that the man had a very talkative subordinate. This made the guy very worried, and then he brushed the tape off the table and began to trample on it, trying to crush it. Soon he succeeded and even chuckled that Chester was throwing such an important proof. But then Henson took out another tape and explained that it was only a copy, and this one had the same thing. Chester offered to give him this tape so that he could vent his anger, and Chester began to ask what was required of him. Henson realized that the KGB had not given him the full information, adding that he had found a way to pass the tape to a body subordinate to their government. That they had left a stain on the management of the Honorable Asian Games. Chester was going to inform the king of their country. The man's brother also holds a high position, and now his family will be branded as traitors who have shamed the country and the king. The man understood that he had to stop it, but he did not know how the judo coach was connected to the KGB, although it was not so important now. He immediately fell to his knees and asked what he should do now. Then Chester said that they would not object to doping tests. After all, their athletes are innocent and the test results will show this, and he also does not want to put this person in a difficult position. Then he offered to defend the honor of the competition by refusing those countries that incited him. The man realized that this guy was initially sure that this test was provoked by another country. Henson could see from his reaction that he had been bribed and reminded him that he was giving him a chance not to tarnish the honor of the Asian Games. Soon Natalia reported on the phone that this guy was really great because she gave him only personal information about Charles. Based on this and drawing conclusions about his actions in life, he used this as a condition for negotiations. Chester was able to skillfully cope with such an uncontrollable opponent, although he had only a couple of empty, unrecorded tapes. Then Henson called her, reporting that he was done with the case, and then told her to get out of the car. The guy realized that she was watching him, and then said that he was hungry and invited her to have lunch together. Her partner did not understand why she was so surprised, but Natalia did not explain all the details to her. After a while, the broadcast continued, and the commentators explained that there was some kind of commotion due to disagreements about doping. On the part of the organizer, tests were carried out for all athletes, and those who tested positive were disqualified. Now everything is in order again, and the competition continues, and the judo final, which the audience has been waiting for, has come. The final with the participation of the athlete Chester will begin very soon, and the director encouraged him that there was one last step left. His opponent is a monster who has won 2 international competitions, but there is no need to be too nervous. The guy also knows his main skill, interception, so Sean asked him to be careful when shooting. For some reason, Henson wondered if he had a dash of French blood, because that guy was really huge. Chester overcame many difficulties to get to where he is now. At such moments, he always feels lonely, as if he is alone in this world. He never thought that he would go so deep into judo. Initially, he used it to gain certificates and be active for the transition to a higher educational institution. Now, he can't call it just a means to get into a university. If he wins here, he will become #1 in Asia. Standing in the arena in front of his opponent, Chester hoped to win just as quickly this time, after which he prepared himself. After the fight began, Henson noticed that he had opened up and decided to attack, but he simply threw his grip away. Chester decided not to panic and immediately try a quick back heel to the inside and go for a shot. The opponent held out again, and Sean shouted at Henson to beware of a counterattack and not to let himself be grabbed by the collar. The opponent's coach shouted that he should not stand and not waste time, but do what is usual because this is his time of victory. This thug was sure that he was invincible and rushed at the Korean, and water dripped from their fingers when they collided. The adversary realized that Chester was also living at the same time as him, and they stared at each other. 30 seconds have passed since the start of the fight, and Chester missed for the first time, because Richard is not an easy opponent. However, Henson has started attacking again and tries to throw his opponent over the thigh. Richard also does not remain in debt. He immediately frees himself and tries to counterattack, and this attack is quite risky. But Chester is also a tough nut to crack, and his opponent quickly retreats a step, and Henson manages to tighten his belt. It was a fierce fight between two opponents, from which it is impossible to take your eyes off, but soon the whistle sounded. Chester didn't understand what had happened, and then he looked at the scoreboard and realized that 3 whole minutes had passed. The time is up and the opponents have not earned a single point, so they get extra time. Spectators thought it was unbelievable, but they were also surprised that Chester didn't get points and thought it was a loss. Someone from the crowd began to shout to those who did not understand not to say stupid things and just continue to watch to the end. Suddenly, Chester's mother, who happened to be in the stadium, began to shout to her son that he would definitely win. The cheers of the fans were getting louder. The fight should continue soon, but Henson felt that his hands and feet were tingling. The body was also weakening, and the guy thought that this was how it should be at the competition and thought that it was cool and fun. Still, he would do his best and deliver the final blow to his opponent, and in the 6th minute they collided again. It seemed that they fought equally on equal strength, but Chester managed to seize the moment and knocked his opponent to the floor. At that moment, 6 minutes struck and the referee's whistle sounded, and Henson was glad that he had won. Commentators were also happy for him that he was guaranteed a gold medal, which he won at judo competitions. Chester's crew immediately began to run to him with joyful calls, and then they rushed to hug him, and the director even cried. Then Henson turned to look at his opponent, who was looking at him. Immediately, Henson was approached by a host, who asked him to answer a few questions and what his impressions were. The guy was naturally happy because he became the champion of Asia, but there is still so much to do to get rid of the stone from the soul and be happy. Chester expressed his gratitude to his coach Sean, as well as his older teammates for their support and care. He also wanted to thank those who came from far away to cheer for him, because their support gave him strength. Suddenly, the guy noticed something in the crowd and immediately rushed there, and the coach and the host could not understand what had happened to him. Chester instantly climbed the steps and stood in front of his mother, asking when she had arrived. She admitted that yesterday, and was also glad that she looked so much like her father with her eagle eye, because he was able to see her from below. Now the guy admitted to her that he had received a gold medal, and she asked him to get up from his knees, realizing that they were now in great pain. Chester listened to her, and then suddenly took her in his arms and showed everyone that she was his mother. After a short time, he began to be awarded a medal as he won the competition. The guy was so happy that he even jokingly tried to bite through this medal, as if checking whether it was real gold. Paul and Casey were working at the time, and he wondered if she would regret it. The girl assured that everything was fine, and it seemed to her that it was right, and Paul pressed the enter button. Casey hoped that the boss would approve of this, and Paul, admitting that heartburn had begun, offered a drink. Chester had by this time returned home and hung his medal in a frame on the wall, while he slept next to him on the floor. When he opened his eyes, he saw his mother, and he was even frightened, not understanding why she was sitting there. She admitted that she did not want to wake him up. He was just always busy, and she hardly saw him, and now she watched him sleep. Chester asked what time it was, and his mother reported that it was 10 o'clock in the morning and suggested that he sleep a little more. But Henson was in a hurry. He had to go to a certain place, and his mother guessed that he had a meeting with someone. The guy explained that the two of them needed to go to the same place today, and the mother began to interrogate where and why. On the way, she did not understand why he took her with him, because today is his day off. Chester only thought that his mother would be surprised, and she did not understand why he was smiling. He led her to a building and asked for her opinion, but her mother thought it too high. But that wasn't what the guy meant, and wondered if she wanted to trade here, and Mrs. Henson decided that it wasn't a bad thing, but the rent was expensive. Then Chester giggled again, and then said they could buy the whole building, and Mother told him not to joke like that. The guy said that he was not joking, and that he had earned a lot, after which he showed his mother a bank book. She could not believe that all this money belonged to him, and hoped that he had done nothing wrong. Chester explained that he earned it while studying by investing, and also hit the jackpot thanks to information from his friend's aunt. Mother was happy and then sad, because it was too much money and she was afraid that he might do something wrong. Mrs. Henson suggested that he should just save up, because if he went to university and got married, the money would come in handy. The guy took her hands and asked her to believe him, because he would never do what she would worry about. Mother naturally believed him, but reminded him that everything in life was not at all as they wanted. Chester explained that the price for this building will at least double in 5 years. Besides, there is a subway nearby. The guy also explained that if they buy this building now, then they won't have to worry about money later. He wanted to thank his mother, who took care of him alone, and from now on he would do everything to make her healthy and happy. Mrs. Henson then agreed, and if her son said so, she was bound to believe him, and Chester thanked her. Then the guy confessed that he loved his mother, and she said that if he did, he should not run away from home so often. Chester also thought that it was time to end the investment associated with the moratorium, and he needed to look into Quan and Park to check the profits. Those two noticed in the morning that there was a mess around them, and they tried to remember how much they had drunk. Therefore, Casey asked for only 1 glass, and did not understand why her colleague could not restrain herself when she drank. Paul explained that lately he had been living looking at 2 monitors, so he could not restrain himself, and at that moment the door slammed. Both of them understood that at such a time only the boss could come here, and they understood that they were now in trouble. As soon as Chester entered, Casey immediately pounced on him with questions, which led him to his day off. Henson wanted to ask them the same thing, and the girl explained that she had come to work and tried to restrain him at the door. The guy seemed suspicious that she went out to meet him and assumed that something had happened, but she assured that everything was fine. She realized that he had come to check on the income, and Chester had already noticed Paul trying to quickly clean up the table. Henson began to wonder what was going on, and then they admitted that after the calculations were completed, they decided to take a break for tea. The guy sniffed and realized that they were drinking very strong tea, and Casey apologized and promised that from now on they would be attentive. Chester chuckled, explaining that they had done a good job, and sometimes there should be days like that, especially since he didn't judge things like an office romance. Suddenly, he noticed that the two seemed to be frozen in shock, and assumed that they really had something. Henson also explained that they hadn't even gotten over the hangover, and he realized that there was something between them as they were embarrassed. The guy decided to pretend not to notice anything, but then he paid attention to the numbers and was shocked, not understanding how it happened. The amount was much larger than expected, and he did not understand whether there could be such a difference. Then he showed it to the employees. There were rumors that, thanks to Natalia, it was possible to significantly increase the percentage of profits, but this clearly exceeded the norm. Casey explained that, in fact, each of them returned 70% of the profits. Henson couldn't believe it. He explained that they shouldn't have overworked themselves and then asked why. The girl admitted that they thought it would be better, and Paul added that they could invest again and earn income. Chester only wondered if they would regret it, but the two were sure, and their boss agreed. He also decided to admit that he also had something for them, and taking out his laptop, he was about to tell what their next plan was. This time, they will focus on the dot-com bubble, and Quan and Park must do everything to make the dot-coms crash again. There was about a year left before the destruction of the bubble. In a year, it will crack, and in 2, it will completely fall apart. Companies that have nothing to do with IT add .com to the name and easily get investments in millions. Chester thought this was not normal, and since America continues to invest without asking, no one has any idea that the bubble will burst so easily. Then, during this period, the amount of damage amounted to $5 trillion, and much more turned into garbage. Casey realized that they needed to hurry, and first they would make a list of all the companies that were associated with IT. Paul will study real-time change rates through foreign investors, and Chester agreed that they should take care of it. Then he got a phone call telling him they were there, and Henson admitted that he wasn't far away and would be there soon. The guy explained that he had a scheduled meeting, so they could finish for today. Casey noted that the boss had become even busier after the Asian Games, but he now had more roles. Soon, Henson met up with friends who were dressed up as if for a radio station, and he did not understand what was wrong with them. Then he nevertheless admitted that such an outfit suits them and asked who was in charge of all this. Then more guys came up and one admitted that it was him, and Jesse explained that David was also with them. They also brought an actor with them, and Chester, when he saw him, realized that his face seemed familiar to him. It was the guy Harry Jones, who was tormented by eternal scars, and he starred in the melodrama Slave Hunters. Chester admitted that he was a big fan of his, and David was surprised to think that they already knew each other. Then they went inside the radio station, which seemed amazing from the inside, and Sarah wanted to see idols. Henson tried to understand why there were so many familiar faces. He recognized a bribe taker, as well as a corrupt official who was also rude. He realized that there was indeed a bonanza here, and even if they were arrested, they would surely only get a promotion. Chester was approached by a girl, Linda Hintz, and asked him to wait a while, and he couldn't remember where he'd heard the name. They sat down at a table, and she wanted to do a preliminary interview in order to select materials for recording. David asked him to do everything right, and while he looked around here, maybe he would find out something. His friend asked him to be careful, and he understood this because everyone was looking around, but if something happened, he would call. Linda Chester explained that this guy lived in America and learned Korean from a grandmother who has her own words. She noticed him as an unusual person, and Henson added that he also trains idols. Now she understood why he immediately seemed so talented to her, and she thought that later he would definitely be in a hurry. In the meantime, Harry reminded his friend that he had asked him to be careful with his words, because he had to make a good impression. After all, he will have a debut, and a friend advised him to use more neutral words. David admitted that that's why he brought him here, because he's very smart. Suddenly, they saw that several people had approached them, who clearly did not have good intentions. The guys began to wonder who they were, and the head of that gang suggested that they chat a little with Uncle Leon. During this time, Chester answered almost all of Linda's questions. Suddenly his phone rang, and the girl allowed him to answer. It was Sarah, who confessed that there was trouble, and then Henson heard David shouting for him to get away. The guy tried to understand what had happened there, but they didn't have time to explain, and David told him again to get out of there. At that moment, Leon took the phone from him, from which Chester's words continued to be heard. The guy realized that there was something serious there, but first he needed to calm down, and then the man spoke. He introduced himself as Leon from the Central District Prosecutor's Office and asked if Henson could speak now. He wanted to ask about what, but the man on the other end of the line said that all the details would be at the meeting. Leon also suggested that he meet in the cafe of the radio station, after which short beeps were heard on Henson's phone. The guy immediately apologized to Linda, explaining that he had an urgent matter, and she was worried that they hadn't finished yet. Chester was rushing down the corridor and soon saw that his friends were surrounded by some guys, and Jesse began to ask him for help. Henson looked around and noticed a guy whom he guessed was the prosecutor who had talked to him. The latter looked at Chester casually and asked him to sit down, while Henson tried to understand what was going on. Then he introduced himself and asked what the man had to do with him, and this modesty surprised Leon quite a bit. He thought that he would start with aggression, but now he behaved completely differently than at the Asian Games. Then he also introduced himself, and the guy admitted that he was flattered that he had seen his duel. Chester also decided to check him just in case, and Leon was surprised that he even knew the name of the department in which this time he found some information about one organization, but there was very suspicious capital in it, and he also learned that it was Chester's account. Then he asked the guy to explain this situation, and he noticed that his questions were similar to the trick of a phone scammer from the future. Leon went on to say that it is the most suspicious and well-known American organization with Filipino roots. At the same time, Henson has a very suspicious friend, and Chester corrected that the prosecutor misunderstood. David is an American of Korean descent, but Leon was surprised that he spoke Korean so poorly. Then he asked to see his ID, and Henson thought that perhaps he could look at the bank transactions without his consent. The guy couldn't remember, but it all looked more and more strange, and he wasn't summoned anywhere, and the prosecutor found him himself. Then Chester asked if Leon had a warrant, and from his reaction he realized that he did not have one, which was also suspicious. Chester then asked why his friends had been seized and called in without a warrant, adding that he was not a suspect but a witness. The prosecutor explained that this was just common sense, and Henson added that access to personal information without a warrant is prohibited. Now, this situation is called a violation of the law on personal data, and Chester does not interfere in the performance of public duties. Then Leon said that he had a warrant, but he could not show it, even if he was called a hero of the country, his current location, and everything was now illogical. Then Henson thought for a moment, and then he knew what it might be and looked around. Behind one of the flower pots, he noticed a hidden camera, but pretended not to see it. Leon still understood from his reaction that this guy guessed something, and his accomplices hoped that they were not noticed. One of them decided that if they noticed, they would immediately reveal it, and the second advised to first make a letter signed by the prosecutor. Soon, Leon provided Henson with a warrant and even offered to go to the investigator's room, where they could continue their conversation. Chester began to think that this was not a lie, and that he had prepared the real warrant beforehand, and now he could not understand anything at all. At this time, Sarah asked her comrades to stop laughing or they would be caught, but Chester heard them and realized that these rascals had just tricked him. And he almost bought it and thought it wasn't fair to end up like that. Then he asked the prosecutor to lend him a pen. After receiving it, the guy began to draw something on the back of the warrant, and the prosecutor watched carefully, hoping to understand what he was writing. Chester wrote that he guessed everything, and if he ended like this, the broadcast would be ruined, and asked Leon to play along with him. The prosecutor was a little surprised that the guy understood everything very quickly, and then made a serious face. He wondered how it would end, and wondered if Henson had time to spare. He was also going to remove the warrant, hoping that the guy would provide him with something later, or at least show a copy of his bank account. Chester said that he stayed at home and asked permission to call, realizing what kind of game Leon was playing. The prosecutor allowed him, but he had to call here, hinting that he had nothing to hide, and the guy agreed. He hoped that if he pretended to be talking to someone, it would work, and now was the right moment. Chester pretended to talk to his mother and asked if his bank account was at home. Then he added that he met the prosecutor on the radio, but there was a real call and the guy did not understand why at that moment. He was told that it was from the Financial Supervisory Services Investigative Committee, which surprised Henson even more. Then he was told that transactions for very large amounts were found on his account, and they wanted to know if he did it himself. Chester realized that this was about the money he had transferred to buy the building for his mother, and confirmed that he had done the transfer himself. Leon, meanwhile, noticed that the guy was confused, but he played well and could even become an actor. Chester then turned around and said that his mother couldn't find the bank account, so he had to go get him personally. The prosecutor hoped that he was not going to run away, and he assured that he had no thoughts, and then began to head for the exit. On the way, he grabbed David's arm and whispered that he should get ready to get off quickly. Henson then told the prosecutor that he didn't know it was a crime. He just wanted to help a friend who had a heartbreaking story. David did not understand what Henson was talking about and what he was guilty of, but then Leon shouted for the detective to arrest them both. Then he added that this was no longer a hidden camera, but everything was real, and they should be detained immediately. The guys were immediately handcuffed, accusing them of banking groups and violating the law on concealment of income. Jesse asked for an explanation of what was going on, not realizing what his friends had done wrong, and Sarah reminded him that it was a hidden camera. She also recalled that she was promised a cultural voucher for cooperation, and Chester realized that he had been deceived due to prejudice. David did not stop shouting all the way that he was not a criminal and innocent, and also shouted that it was a hidden cell. People around were also surprised, not understanding what was happening, and the observers in the car did not understand what to do with it now. One of them was about to go there to investigate, and soon caught up with the prosecutor, asking him what they should do now. Leon asked him to stop wailing, because this is how he protects the criminal now. The guy understood that if something happened, they would cancel the program and ask the prosecutor to clarify the situation. He only promised that he would explain everything later on the phone and went on, leaving the puzzled director with a bunch of questions.